They childhood friends that fell hard for each other.
He just swept her off her feet and she fell in love with him.
A devoted mother and a military man with 3 beautiful children.
They seem to be living a typical American dream lifestyle.
But just when it seemed their happy lives were complete, a brutal murder rips their world apart.
But something had to have gone horribly wrong for this scenario to emerge.
As detectives dig into the investigation, they discover a sinister plot.
The allegations that were being made floored me, that somebody would do something like that.
When we found out who it was just shocking.
The web of lies so tangled, it leaves everyone wondering if they'll ever know the truth.
And there were just all of these layers to this.
Now we're trying to figure out, okay, how does all this come together?
Nothing was adding up.
Everything just kept pulling us in more and more. What's really going on here?
Monday, October 26, 2009. All is quiet in Logan Square, a charming neighborhood on Chicago's North Side. But that evening, 911 receives a call from this peaceful pocket of the Windy City.
This is 911. You need police or fire? I'm not sure.
The caller identifies himself as Darren Brewer, and he's concerned about his 22-year-old wife, Kenya Tay. Darren says she disappeared late Sunday night.
Did you try to contact her by phone?
Yes, me, her mom, dad, and sister been calling her all day and texting, and no response.
Darren hasn't heard from Kenya Tay, but he tells the 911 operator that he's found something that could help police track her down.
And as we're driving, we see my car in the alley.
Okay, one that she drives all the time?
Yes.
Oh, okay. What type of vehicle is it?
It's a 2001 Chevy.
Okay, we're going to send the police. Belden and Kildare, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
As police head to Logan Square to check things out, Darren waits for word about his beloved wife. But no one could imagine just how dark and twisted this troubling case was about to get. Kenya Tay Collier Brewer was a born and bred Chicago girl. The oldest of 3 siblings, she always stood out in a crowd, even at a young age.
Kenya Tay, she just had a great heart. She loved to smile. She just loved to have fun. Kenya Tay was a very bright student, inquisitive growing up. She was very outgoing.
But Kenya Tay wasn't just smart. She was blessed with brains and beauty.
Oh yeah, all the boys liked her. She was not a big flirt, but everyone told her how pretty she was.
And with every good-looking young man in her neighborhood trying their best to get with her, Kenya Tay sometimes found it hard to hold out for Mr. Right. By the time she was 18, she was pregnant with her first child.
I remember when she first had her first son, how happy she was and excited she was. And she just wanted to be a really good mother.
The second she began having children, she became very serious about it. Going back to school, studying nursing, graduating with honors.
After graduating, Kenya Tay began working as a nurse's assistant and had high hopes of making a career out of doing something she loved.
She just loved helping people. She loved working with the elderly.
By 2006, everything was coming together for this bright young woman. But she also wanted the right man by her side.
Kenya?
Darren, hi.
Hey.
Turns out, he had been hiding in plain sight.
Actually knew Darren Brewer from early in her childhood.
And when their paths crossed again in adulthood, the chemistry was undeniable.
They had known each other for such a long time. There was that belief that they were meant to be together.
I'm definitely gonna call you.
He just swept her off her feet and she fell in love with him.
Like Kenya Tay, fellow Chicago native Darren Brewer was smart and ambitious.
He had a pretty big personality. He seemed to be an intelligent person.
He was making a name for himself. He had a nice job at the Illinois National Guard.
It didn't take long for Kenya Tay to realize she wanted to spend her life with Darren.
It was kind of a whirlwind romance by all accounts. Some people fall in love, in a few months and they get married and they live happily ever after.
Her and Darren were very young and they got married. She just wanted to really complete her life.
Before long, that life included 2 more kids of their own. Both at the young age of 22, Kenya Tay and Darren seemed to have it all.
She had married the man of her dreams, man in uniform, that was helping her with her first son, and they had 2 other beautiful children. She also had a good job. She was continuing her education, so she felt that she was living out her dreams.
Which makes it all the more surprising when Kenyatte goes missing one Sunday night in October of 2009. Early the next morning, Darren reaches out to friends and family for help.
Hello? Have you heard from Kenyatte?
No, I haven't talked to her today.
When we made contact with Darren, he said that they had a normal evening. Kenyatte came in from work, put the kids down. He was tired, was going to bed.
And she went out with a couple friends.
He sent her a text message asking her to bring back milk. He got no response. He went to sleep, woke up, and she still wasn't home.
We started to panic, so we felt that it was time for the authorities to get involved.
8 hours into Kenyatte's disappearance, Darren contacts police,
I'd like to report a missing person.
but is told he'd have to wait a few more hours before he can file a missing persons report.
Police often tell people to wait 24 hours to report someone missing to make sure they actually are missing. It could be a false alarm.
Left with few options, Darren holds out hope that his wife would soon turn up. But that evening, after picking up their kids from daycare, Darren spots something chilling along his drive home.
He discovers his wife's vehicle parked unattended in an alley. That's when he makes a 911 call.
With 3 small children in the car, Darren decides it's best not to stop and examine his wife's car. Instead, he drives the short distance home and waits for law enforcement to search the vehicle.
When the police first arrived at the car, there was nothing unusual. There was no damage to the car, and there was no one inside.
Unlocked.
The doors were unlocked. They searched the inside of the vehicle, and they didn't find anything.
But moments later, everything changes.
One of the officers pressed the trunk release button. The other officer at the rear of the vehicle at that time made a gruesome discovery.
There was a woman's body stuffed inside. She was wearing a nurse's uniform. She had blood covering her head. She was clearly deceased.
She still had her name tag on, so they knew it was Darren's wife, Kenyatte Brewer.
So now, at this point, the missing persons case has turned into a homicide.
Why would someone kill this popular, attractive young woman who seemingly had everything going for her? Just didn't make sense.
What investigators don't realize is that Kenyatte's mysterious death is about to open a Pandora's box of deception and greed, the horrific likes of which no one will ever forget.
Everyone has been shocked, hoping that it was still not true.
Devoted couple Darren Brewer and Kenyatte Collier Brewer had promising careers, a loving marriage, and a happy home with 3 adorable children.
They seem to be living the typical American dream lifestyle. He was a nice-looking fellow employed with the Illinois National Guard in service to his country, and she was a nurse's assistant.
But all that changed on October 26, 2009. After having gone missing, Kenyatte is found dead in the trunk of her own car in the northwest side of Chicago.
Kenyatte is church-going, loving mother and wife, not the person that you would expect to end up in this situation.
How does a lady like her end up in the back of a trunk?
At the crime scene, detectives try to find some answers to this mystery.
What we got?
Investigators were called to the scene. They were trying to figure out what happened, what was going on.
They're looking at the body, and it's obvious that Kenyatte has been shot in the head. Her body is then removed to confirm her cause of death and hopefully to find some evidence that can be linked back to the killer.
Unfortunately, the scene provides few clues as to how Kenyatte ended up there.
You're looking for a shell casing from the bullet. You're looking for a gun. You're looking for a shoe, a glove, anything that would give you an idea of who the suspect was.
Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Nothing seemed out of place. There were no clues as to say what happened, what led up to this.
Without hard evidence, detectives must consider all possibilities.
Was it a robbery gone bad? Was it a simple carjacking? Did the crime happen here? Or was her body dumped here?
Robberies and carjackings are crimes of opportunity, and the people that perpetrate those crimes, generally they select likely victims. She would have probably been an appealing target with a nurse's uniform, small build, 5'2", 130 pounds. That had to be considered.
But as police know, a deadly robbery would be highly unusual in the quiet Logan Square neighborhood.
Carjackings, robberies, things of that nature in that particular area don't happen with any high frequency at all. Crime scene tape in this neighborhood was a big deal. A canvass was conducted. That's standard, did anybody see anything, hear anything?
While CSIs continue to process the scene, detectives are left with the grim task of informing Kenyate's husband, Darren, of his wife's death.
We've identified the body of your deceased wife.
You can't imagine that someone would hurt her. Not his caring wife, not the woman that everyone loved. He just can't imagine that someone would want to hurt her like this.
We are sorry for your loss.
Detectives have no reason to suspect Darren had anything to do with his wife's death, but maybe Darren can help them track down the killer.
Did your wife have any enemies?
Was there previous history of violence? Does she have a criminal background? Does she live a high-risk lifestyle?
Darren is positive Kenyate wasn't involved in any illegal activity, but he then says something startling.
There was this one incident last year.
Approximately a year earlier, Kenyate was exiting the residence along with her husband, Darren. She actually sustained a gunshot while she was 6 months pregnant. And in fact, her husband had also sustained a less serious injury as well.
Anything ever developed from that?
No, sir.
Was there anything else that's ever happened?
A few weeks before her murder, she was cut in the face with a bottle. Someone threw a bottle at her while she was in the car.
They were sitting at a stoplight, and all of a sudden, here comes this bottle flying through the window and cut her face.
Initially, it seemed the attacks on Kenyate were random and unrelated. But now, detectives wonder if they are somehow connected to our murder.
Give us a call if there's anything else you can think of.
Detectives obviously had to take them into consideration if there was some type of a ongoing threat to her person.
If someone has been attacked and then turns up dead, it seems as though this may not be a random act of violence. Detectives have to ask themselves then if someone is out to get her.
It seems impossible that this devoted mother and nurse's assistant could have any enemies whatsoever. But detectives are about to learn that a shocking secret may have sparked a vicious act of retribution.
The lies and jealousy and the betrayal is unreal.
And Kenyate Collier Brewer and their 3 kids had a picture-perfect life together. But that fairy tale was shattered when Kenyate was found shot dead in the trunk of her own car.
This young woman who was bursting with energy was gone, and now there's this void. In one fell swoop, the mother's gone, and now these children are motherless.
The family was grieving, but then also there's her husband, Darren. He's grieving. He's lost his wife, the mother of his kids.
They were reeling, just totally reeling, trying to make sense of all of it.
Meanwhile, detectives are trying to figure out if Kenyate had been specifically targeted. Darren tells them she had been the victim of 2 violent crimes over the past year.
It starts to look like someone is actually out to hurt her, that she's not just a random victim.
The second attack on Kenyate left severe cuts to her face. The detectives have to ask then, could this be more personal?
Investigators need to learn more about their victim, so they go to her family. Like husband Darren, they're still overwhelmed by Kenyate's death.
Our worst nightmare had come true.
She worked hard. She didn't do any drugs. She took care of her family. She did a lot of family-oriented activities.
When she left work, did someone follow her? Did the car break down? Our minds was just racing and just really could not come to grips with still who could have done this to her.
With the family at a loss for an explanation, and with police finding no suspects in the first 2 attacks, the investigation seems to have hit a dead end. That is, until police ask about Kenyate and Darren's relationship.
They had a good relationship. Darren was very good with the kids.
Darren Brewer looked like a family man. He was in the military. He expected to be deployed out to Afghanistan.
But all was not well in paradise.
When you say appeared to be the perfect couple, could you elaborate?
The family has learned that Darren has been keeping a deep, dark secret.
He was having an affair.
He's got another lover.
With whom?
It was a man.
Darren had been in the closet and in denial about his sexual orientation, but it got to the point where he just couldn't deny it anymore. Darren was gay and was having an affair.
It was still somewhat shocking to some of the family members and maybe to Kenya Tay as well that the affair he was having was in fact with a man.
But apparently, Darren had no intention of leaving his wife.
He has this polished image. I have a wife, I have kids that I love. So no one can find out about this. No one can find out how he's been living a double life.
He had a military career at risk. He had this, at least on paper, little family unit that he was trying to maintain for appearances.
According to Kenya Tay's family, even after she discovered Darren's secret life, the couple continued to live together. But Kenya Tay became increasingly unhappy while Darren sought comfort in the arms of his male lover.
Once you start hearing those details, all it just leaves you with more and more questions. And everything just kept pulling us in more and more. Like, what's really going on here?
The family is now wondering if this has something to do with Kenya Tay's death.
In speaking to Kenya Tay's family, detectives learned the man Darren has been seeing is named Joseph Matthews.
When detectives determine that someone is having an affair, it raises all sorts of questions.
That's a pretty big moment, because now you've got what you think is some sort of motive.
If Darren doesn't want to get a divorce because he doesn't want to put his career at risk, that could have caused problems for Darren's boyfriend. Detectives have to consider whether Darren's boyfriend wanted to end the marriage at any cost.
There's only one way to find out. Detectives must find Darren's boyfriend.
He's become involved in this now, whether he wants to be or not.
On the evening of October 26, 2009, police track down Joseph Matthews and bring him in for questioning.
Have a seat here.
Detectives immediately confront him about his relationship with Darren.
How long have you known each other?
I've known him since May.
Were you intimate?
Yes, we were.
Joseph is forthcoming about his relationship with Darren, and when the conversation turns to Kenya Tay, Joseph makes a startling admission.
I knew they had kids, but Darren never told me he was married.
Not only does Joseph deny harboring any ill will towards Kenya Tay, he seems genuinely upset about her death. Still, detectives are curious about his whereabouts on the night of October 25th. According to Joseph, while he admits that he saw Darren earlier that evening, he was at home, in bed, at the time of the crime.
Anyone see you?
Yeah, my roommates.
You have a number we can call?
Yeah.
Detectives speak to Joseph's roommates and ultimately verify his alibi. At that point, they have no choice but to cut him loose. With their primary suspect all but eliminated, police can't help but wonder, if Joseph didn't kill Kenya Tay, then who did? Before detectives can consider their next move, they get a surprising new lead.
Darren comes to the police with a bombshell.
What can you tell us, Darren?
I know who killed my wife.
Who?
It was my brother.
He named his brother Dewan as being the gunman who actually shot and killed Kenya Tay.
Police are stunned. Darren has just identified his wife's killer. But why would Darren's brother Dewan want to kill Kenya Tay? According to Darren, Kenya Tay came to him a few weeks earlier with a disturbing allegation.
Kenya Tay tells her husband that in fact his brother came over and forcibly raped her.
Darren confronted his brother, but his brother said that it was not a rape.
He said it was consensual.
She was not that type of a person. She loved her husband. She loved her kids. So I find it very hard to believe that she consented to have sex with him, period.
According to Darren, if the sex wasn't consensual, then Dewan had ample motive to murder Kenyete.
Darren thinks that he may have killed Kenyete to keep her quiet.
It's a stunning accusation, but police are curious why Darren waited so long to tell them.
He's my brother.
He says he didn't say anything at first because it was his brother, but now he's afraid for his and his children's safety.
This, of course, is a huge development in the case.
Do you know where your brother is?
He's at his girlfriend's house.
We're gonna need an address.
Darren tells police that Dewan has been staying with his girlfriend and gives them the address. They go to the house. Police think they're about to get their suspect.
Is Mr. Poe on the premises right now?
He's nowhere to be found.
They make contact with the girlfriend at location, and in short order, she gives them a consent to search.
Go ahead, guys.
They scour the apartment, and between two mattresses, they find a .380 semi-automatic pistol.
Detective.
The gun is the same caliber as the bullet recovered from Kenyete's body.
I have a gun.
Police are hot on his trail, and he's nice enough to leave a murder weapon right there, you know, where he laid his head.
At this point in the investigations, the detectives have a motive. They have the weapon. They just need to find the suspect.
But just when it appears they are on the verge of solving the case, detectives get a tip that changes everything.
It's definitely an onion where layers are being peeled back. What are we going to find out now about this case?
Kenyete Collier Brewer, a beautiful mother of 3, was discovered dead, stuffed in the trunk of her car. The crime itself was shocking enough. But investigators were even more surprised to learn that Kenyete's husband, Darren, was having an affair with another man. But during his interrogation, Darren named his own brother, Dewan Poe, as the killer.
When Darren comes forward and points the finger at his brother, this is a huge development in the case. The murder suspect has landed in their laps, and it changes the whole course of the investigation.
Darren says he thinks Dewan killed her to keep her quiet about an alleged rape Dewan committed against Kenyete.
The motivation came along with the fear that Kenyete might accuse him of rape.
A search of Dewan's girlfriend's apartment turns up the murder weapon. All detectives need to do now is find Dewan Poe. Police fan out in search of Dewan and soon hit pay dirt. A local gas station attendant claims he may know something about the case.
In police work, there is no bad lead. Some may be a dead end, some may turn out to be actually good.
Police drive to the south side of Chicago, more than 15 miles away from where Kenyete was discovered. At the gas station, an employee describes an incident that took place the night Kenyete disappeared.
The other night, I'm working the register.
The gas station attendant tells detectives that when he was working Sunday night, he heard a woman scream.
So I look outside and I see a couple standing there.
And there was another man wearing a mask that looked like he had a gun.
So he puts the man in the driver's seat and the woman in the passenger seat.
Get in the car and drive!
And then he himself gets in the vehicle and they speed away.
The attendant tells police he reported the incident, but detectives will need more information in order to determine if it was connected to Kenyete's murder.
Did you see what color the car was?
It was blue.
Kenyete's car was indeed blue, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was the one used in the carjacking witnessed by the attendant.
You have camera surveillance here too, right?
Yeah, I've got them everywhere.
If you don't care, could we have a look at that?
Hey, sure. Come on back.
It was private surveillance video that really showed everything.
Specifically, the video shows Darren and Kenyete at the gas station together.
Detectives watch the video and see Darren and Kenyete pull into the gas station.
That shows the vehicle that Kenyete was later discovered murdered in.
The video also shows Darren and Kenyete's children sitting in the back seat of the car.
Then a masked gunman appears in the footage.
Is it possible Darren and Kenyete were carjacked, and that's how Kenyete ended up dead? Detectives mull this over as they watch the surveillance video. That's when they notice something very peculiar.
What's he doing in the trunk?
Before Darren gets back into the car, he goes to the trunk and rearranges some things around.
Yeah, that's odd.
Can you pause that right there?
Yes, sir. This is the same trunk where Kenyate's body was found less than 24 hours later. That's suspicious.
The surveillance footage raises a bunch of questions. Why didn't Darren mention the carjacking when he reported Kenyate missing to the police? Why was he rearranging things in the trunk?
To answer those questions, detectives haul Darren back down to the station and confront him about the surveillance footage.
Darren, you know why you're here.
We saw all the surveillance at the gas station.
He basically, at that point, identifies his brother, Dewan Poe, as, in fact, the person that carjacked him.
What happened next?
He left for Kenyate. I didn't know he was going to do anything like this.
Why didn't you tell us this before?
I didn't want my brother to go to prison.
Darren says that he didn't mention the carjacking initially because he was trying to protect his brother.
To detectives, Darren's news story doesn't ring entirely true.
Darren's claim that he kept the carjacking from the police to protect his brother just doesn't add up. Because again, why is he moving stuff around in the trunk?
Why he would let this happen, just get out of the car and let Dewan go off without calling anybody. It just didn't seem to make any sense.
I'm not buying it. Stand up.
Convinced that he and brother Dewan conspired to murder Kenyate, detectives placed Darren under arrest. Shortly after that, Dewan gets wind of his brother's arrest and turns himself in.
He knew they were coming for him.
Darren and Dewan are charged with first-degree murder. Kenyate's family is stunned. They can't believe Darren was involved.
Darren was pretending to be such a wonderful husband, but it was just all fake. It was fake, it was phony, it was staged.
But what exactly was Darren's motive for murdering Kenyate? Protecting his brother? Keeping his homosexual affair under wraps? Or something else? As Darren and Dewan's trial plays out, it becomes evident that the motive in this case was even more heinous than anyone ever imagined.
It could have been a film. It could have been either a B movie or it could have been an Oscar award-winning film. The details were just so ridiculous.
In June 2013, almost 4 years after Kenyate Collier Brewer was brutally murdered, the trial begins for her accused killers, her husband, Darren Brewer, and his brother, Dewan Poe.
We were really anticipating the trial, wanting to just get through it, get it over with, so that they can pay for what they've done.
In an unusual move, the state decides the two brothers will be tried together, though they will be represented by separate legal counsel. And when their respective attorneys deliver their opening statements, it becomes clear the brothers are willing to throw each other under the bus in order to save their own skin.
It kind of became a brother against brother situation. The defense attorneys each kind of blamed the other's client. Dewan Poe's attorney said he had nothing to do with it. It was all Darren Brewer's plan. Darren Brewer's attorney said he was in denial. He didn't know what was going to happen when Dewan and Kenyate drove away in that car.
But there's one thing Dewan and Darren's attorneys can agree on. The dueling versions of the crime indicate there's enough reasonable doubt to acquit both men on all charges.
The defense attorneys for Darren Brewer and Dewan Poe said the evidence was lacking.
Prosecutors countered that the brothers conspired to murder Kenyate and concocted the fake carjacking as a ruse to mask their involvement in the crime. Only after the surveillance video implicated both of them in the crime did the brothers turn on each other.
There seemed to be this faithfulness where Dewan would try and go do this for his brother. Then once they're in the courtroom, they're turning on each other.
As for motive, prosecutors claim Darren would go to any length, including murder, to keep his superiors at the National Guard from learning about his secret gay life.
Darren had an image to maintain, especially with the military. If they would have learned that he was gay, it may have jeopardized his career.
But prosecutors argue Darren's motive had a financial angle as well.
Apparently there was an insurance policy. It was initially $50,000 that had recently been increased.
At the time of the murder, Darren had life insurance policies on Kenyate totaling more than $150,000. Policies, prosecutors say, would be worthless in the event of a divorce.
If the marriage ended, the life insurance policies could go away.
Darren has reached a point of no return. He's maybe feeling some sense of desperation. I've got this relationship with this fellow that I want to continue. It probably had him at a point where he's like, my wife, Kenya Tay, has got to die.
So now he needs to move quickly. So Darren and his brother plotted together to kill her and that they would split this money.
There's an additional reason.
According to prosecutors, in DeJuan's case, the insurance money is only half the motive.
To prevent her from making a rape allegation against one of these defendants.
Not only do we have Darren trying to cash in on a life insurance policy, we also have the two brothers trying to silence Kenya Tay about the rape. There aren't very many cases where you have two motives.
Ladies and gentlemen, allegations and suppositions do not a case make.
Darren's defense attorney calls the state's theory preposterous and argues that brother DeJuan acted alone when he murdered Kenya Tay.
DeJuan cold-bloodedly and with malice took the life of Kenya Tay.
They said that it was DeJuan Poe who was the actual trigger man. He's the one who stood over Kenya Tay and fired 2 messengers of death into her head.
It's an allegation DeJuan's defense attorney has difficulty refuting, given police had recovered the murder weapon from underneath his bed. But if that was the case, why hadn't Darren tried to stop his brother from murdering Kenya Tay? Darren's defense attorney argues it's because Darren thought DeJuan was just going to scare Kenya Tay into keeping quiet about the rape allegations and had no idea his brother intended to kill her.
That night when DeJuan carjacked Darren and Kenya Tay and the kids, Darren's attorney said that he believed that they were just going to have a conversation, that DeJuan and Kenya Tay were going to sit in the car and talk and figure out how to handle what had happened between them.
But prosecutors assert Darren knew exactly what was about to transpire that evening. And to back up their assertion, they call the defendant's cousin, Taryn Webb, to the stand to testify.
Taryn, do I understand you overheard a conversation between these two brothers?
Yes, sir. Well, there was a first attempt. They wanted to go over to her house and strangle her and make it look like a robbery gone bad.
The initial plan is that DeJuan Poe is going to kill the wife and make it look like maybe an apparent robbery gone bad.
And what happened after that?
I guess he went and got sidetracked, and he didn't end up killing her. He ended up having sex with her.
When he went to do it, he saw her coming out of the bathroom and became aroused, and they had sex.
It's very striking to me that he went to the home supposedly to strangle her, but had sex with her. There's something very twisted and psychotic about that.
Taryn says this was the alleged rape Kenya Tay told Darren about.
So now DeJuan and Darren come up with a plan that they definitely have to get rid of her. They need the life insurance money. They can't have this rape allegation out there. Darren has another lover. They must do something. They then devise a plan to do a carjacking.
Following Taryn's chilling testimony, prosecutors paint a picture of what happened next. After Kenya Tay finished work on the evening of October 25th, she picked up Darren and the kids and asked him to drive home because she was tired after her long shift.
He got off of the Dan Ryan Expressway on the south side of the city, and he didn't go to just the first gas station off the expressway. He went several blocks west, and that's where it all seemed to begin.
Hey, get in the car! Get in the driver's seat now! Get in the front seat!
With Darren and Kenya Tay's children looking on, a masked DeJuan played out the fake carjacking to an unwitting Kenya Tay. After leaving the gas station, Darren pulled into a dimly lit alley not far from their home in Logan Square.
Shut the hell up and get in the trunk.
Whatever you do not hurt me.
DeJuan orders her into the trunk.
Shut up before I kill you.
Darren ends up being dropped off with the kids, and then DeJuan drives off with her in the trunk. He doesn't go very far before the car is discovered in very close proximity to their residence up on the north side.
According to prosecutors, unaware that she knew her abductor, a frightened Kenyate begged for mercy.
No, please don't.
But Dewan showed none.
He ends up cold-bloodedly killing her.
It's a gruesome account, but it's also complicated and could make the jury's job difficult. Dewan pulled the trigger, but was Darren the crime's real mastermind?
I feel that Darren lured his brother in with the money. And to me, it's like this is something that he had premeditated.
And of course, in Dewan Poe's instance, obviously he was looking to have a financial gain, and now he's secondarily motivated by the fact that there's a possibility that he's going to be arrested with her outcry of this rape that he's saying was consensual.
Between the multiple motives and conflicting accounts, it seems like the road to a guilty verdict is a bumpy one. But prosecutors still have one card left to play. And for these two alleged murderers, it will mean the difference between a life of freedom or one behind bars.
There was a good sense that the other shoe was going to drop at some point.
The trial of brothers Darren Brewer and Dewan Poe has revealed a bizarre plot that prosecutors claim culminated with the murder of Darren's wife, Kenyate Collier Brewer.
You got this guy that's known his wife his whole life, but all along he's got this secret life that he's trying to hide from her.
The news that Darren was gay and had relationships, and the fact that the brother was supposed to have strangled his sister-in-law and then wound up having sex with her.
There were just all of these layers to this. The failed attempt to kill her the first time in the carjacking. How cold it seemed to be driving the car with your wife in the trunk and your kids right there, and then just to walk away.
But with each brother pointing the finger at the other, is it possible they both could walk?
Despite all of the loyalty that had allegedly been shown between the two brothers, the one carrying out this plan for the other, the one trying to protect the other against the rape allegation, that all ended in the courtroom.
Despite all of the back and forth, prosecutors have an ace up their sleeve, one they've been holding since the day the two brothers were arrested.
Darren confessed on videotape.
It's damning evidence. There's nothing more powerful than a confession.
Prosecutors contend Darren's confession is proof their theory about the crime is legit. And after closing arguments, the jury begins to deliberate. Kenyate's family hopes they'll deliver some measure of justice.
When someone does something like this, you want them to be punished. And that's what we wanted. We wanted them to be punished.
After several hours of deliberation, the jury announces it's reached verdicts for both Darren and Dewan.
The verdict on both of the brothers was guilty. Darren was sentenced to 99 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections, and his brother, Dewan, received life sentence plus 21 years.
It was a relief. They got what they deserved. You act like an animal, then you need to be treated like one.
Although Kenyate's family feels vindicated, the verdicts can't fill the void created by her death or the pain brought by Darren and Dewan's cold-blooded actions motivated by secrets, greed, and double lives.
It's like somebody has really ripped your heart right out of your chest. You know, no anesthesia, just in and out. Just clawed your heart out of your chest.
We're looking at two young men who clearly have some severe sociopathy within them. At best, she ran into some bad characters. At worst, she walked into a setup.
What should have been a promising future for a young soldier in the Illinois National Guard and his nurse wife and their three lovely children.
The scorching Arizona sun had just dipped below the desert horizon on a suffocating July evening in 2006 when the dynamic of an entire neighborhood shifted from mundane suburban quiet to absolute, cold-blooded terror. It began not with a scream, not with the screech of tires or the explosive echo of gunfire, but with a sudden, unnatural silence that seemed to swallow the block whole. A screen door banged shut on a modest single-story home nestled deep within the suburban sprawl of North Phoenix, and with that final, hollow sound, an individual simply ceased to exist. In the days that followed, the dry desert wind swept through the empty driveway, blowing dust across a concrete pad where a vehicle should have been parked, while inside the house, a dinner table remained half-set, forks resting on napkins and a television softly murmuring to an empty living room. Neighbors glanced over their block walls, noticing the absence, but initially dismissing it as a sudden summer vacation or an unannounced trip to the cooler air of the northern mountains. But as the days bled into weeks, the silence hardened into an oppressive weight, a suffocating realization that whatever had transpired behind those closed blinds was not a voluntary departure, but something far more sinister. The police were finally called, their boots crunching loudly on the gravel driveway as they approached the front porch, noting the stack of unopened mail yellowing in the intense heat and the strange, metallic tang that seemed to linger in the stagnant air near the side gate. When they breached the perimeter, pushing past the locked front door into the stifling heat of the uncooled interior, they found a home frozen in mid-motion, a half-empty cup of coffee on the counter, a purse resting on the entryway table containing keys and ID cards, but no sign of life. The initial sweep revealed no obvious pools of blood, no overturned furniture, and no shattered glass to indicate a violent home invasion, yet the seasoned detectives felt the unmistakable hair rays of a crime scene. It was the perfect vanishing act, a disappearance so clean, so absolute, that it defied the chaotic nature of typical street violence, launching what would become a 20-year descent into frustration, dead ends, and a haunting community trauma that refused to fade. The investigation hit an immediate brick wall of absolute static, a void where logic failed and evidence evaporated into the shimmering desert heat wave. Forensic teams spent days meticulously dusting the interior surfaces, lifting latent prints from light switches and door frames, but every single biological trace belonged to the resident or known, verified utility workers who had visited weeks prior. The missing person report circulated through the media with urgent, flashing graphics, displaying a smiling photograph that contrasted sharply with the grim reality of the empty house, but the phone lines at the tip center remained completely dead. Detectives walked the neighborhood grid, knocking on every door within a 3-block radius, asking the same repetitive questions into the faces of exhausted residents who could only offer blank stares and shrugs. Nobody had heard an argument. Nobody had seen a strange vehicle idling at the curb, and the local surveillance systems of the era, primitive, low-resolution garage cameras, showed nothing but the empty street shimmering in the afternoon sun. The case file, initially thick with high-priority search mandates and rapid response directives, slowly began to thin as the weeks turned into months, without a single actionable lead. It became a phantom entry in the police database, a name sheet filed under the dreaded classification of a cold case, a ghost story whispered by rookie officers during late-night shifts in the North Phoenix precinct. The community tried to return to normal. Children played on the asphalt and lawnmowers roared on Saturday mornings, but the empty house remained a dark tooth in the smile of the street, its boarded windows staring out like blind eyes. For nearly 2 decades, the mystery lay buried in the dirt, a hidden horror covered by layers of suburban dust, waiting for a crack in the silence that everyone assumed would last forever. Then, on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 2026, the entire architecture of the 20-year-old mystery collapsed with a single, untraceable phone call to the homicide division. The caller's voice was completely flat, devoid of emotion, a low murmur that sounded like someone reading a factual report from a teleprompter before hanging up without leaving a name or a return number. The message was brief, specific, and delivered with a chilling certainty that sent shockwaves through the department. The answers to the 2006 disappearance were not scattered across the desert or hidden in another state, but were buried precisely 6 feet beneath the hard-packed clay of the property's own backyard. Within an hour, unmarked police cruisers and heavy forensic transport vans tore through the suburban neighborhood, their tires screeching against the asphalt as they sealed off the block with high-visibility yellow crime scene tape. Neighbors pressed their faces against window screens, watching in utter disbelief as a team of forensic anthropologists and excavation specialists marched into the backyard equipped with ground-penetrating radar units and heavy shovels. The radar equipment rolled across the dry, sun-baked earth, its digital display ticking erratically before locking onto a distinct anomaly shaped like a human form buried deep beneath the roots of an old mesquite tree. The excavation began under a heavy, breathless silence, the rhythmic thud of metal shovels cutting through the compact clay echoing through the neighborhood like a countdown timer. Hours pulled into the afternoon as layers of dirt were carefully brushed away, revealing a dark, degradation-resistant plastic tarp tightly wrapped with industrial-grade duct tape. As the forensic team carefully sliced through the synthetic material, the unmistakable flash of human remains appeared, preserved by the arid desert soil, sending a wave of absolute horror through the onlookers. The discovery of the backyard burial instantly transformed the quiet suburban property into ground zero for a high-intensity forensic reconstruction. The medical examiner's team erected a massive black privacy tent over the excavation site, shielding the grim reality of the grave from the prying lenses of news helicopters hovering overhead. Inside the perimeter, the air was thick with the scent of ancient earth and chemical preservation as specialists used fine brushes and dental picks to expose the skeletal remains without disturbing the surrounding soil context. Every single grain of dirt was sifted through wire mesh screens, recovering tiny, critical fragments of evidence: a rusted zipper slider, a broken plastic button, and a distinctive piece of metallic jewelry that matched the description of items worn by the victim on the night of the disappearance. The physical trauma on the skeletal structure was immediately apparent to the anthropologists. The skull bore the unmistakable, concussive impact marks of a heavy, blunt object, indicating a sudden and violent assault from behind. This was not an accidental overdose or a natural death hidden out of panic. It was a cold, calculated execution followed by an immediate, highly organized concealment effort designed to last for eternity. The sheer proximity of the grave to the living quarters was the most chilling aspect of the discovery, proving that the killer had stood in that very yard, digging into the earth under the cover of the 2006 darkness, while the rest of the neighborhood slept just yards away. The identification process moved with rapid, modern efficiency, utilizing advanced rapid DNA sequencing technology that didn't exist when the victim first vanished into the desert night. Within 24 hours, the laboratory confirmed a flawless genetic match, officially transforming the anonymous skeletal remains back into the missing person from the 2006 cold case file. The announcement hit the local news streams like a lightning bolt, the flashing red banners reading "Cold Case Solved," dominating screens across the valley and triggering a flood of mixed emotion through the community. The shock was palpable. People who had lived on the block for 20 years suddenly realized they had been walking past a hidden cemetery every single day, their backyard barbecues and childhood games taking place just feet from a clandestine grave. The focus of the homicide task force shifted instantly from historical documentation to an aggressive, high-velocity hunt for the individual who had owned the property during that fateful summer 2 decades ago. The paper trail was extensive, a digital labyrinth of property deeds, bank records, and historical tax filings that revealed a complex chain of ownership changes immediately following the disappearance. Detectives pulled the original occupant records, matching the names against current criminal registries, border crossing logs, and active driver's license databases across all 50 states. They discovered that the primary suspect had fled the state within 48 hours of the murder, abandoning the property to foreclosure and changing their identity multiple times to blend into the shadows of a distant Midwestern city. The arrest team closed in on a nondescript apartment complex in a quiet suburb of Chicago just as the morning sun was breaking through the heavy Midwestern fog. The suspect, now an aging individual lined with the visible stress of a lifetime spent looking over their shoulder, was blindsided as tactical officers breached the door with weapons drawn. There was no dramatic shootout, no frantic foot chase through the hallways. There was only the heavy, metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut over wrinkled wrists and the sudden, total collapse of a 20-year lie. During the initial interrogation, the suspect sat in the sterile, fluorescent-lit room, staring blankly at the high-contrast crime scene photographs of the excavated backyard that the detectives spread across the metal table. The arrogance that had sustained a killer for 2 decades evaporated instantly when confronted with the precision of modern forensic science and the undeniable reality of the unearthed tarp. The confession came in a low, trembling whisper, an erratic narrative of a domestic dispute that had escalated into an uncontrollable rage, followed by the frantic, late-night excavation beneath the mesquite tree while the 2006 neighborhood remained completely oblivious. The legal machinery moved swiftly following the extradition, bringing the suspect back to the desert heat of Arizona to face the ultimate reckoning that had been delayed for a generation. The courtroom was packed to absolute capacity during the arraignment, filled with aging relatives of the victim, original investigators who had come out of retirement to witness the conclusion of their forgotten case, and current residents of the block. The reading of the formal charges felt like a heavy, solemn weight dropping onto the floorboards, each word a precise indictment of a horrific act of violence that time had failed to erase. The defense attempted to argue for leniency based on the advanced age of the defendant and the historical nature of the evidence, but the prosecution counteracted with the sheer, calculated cruelty of the backyard concealment. The judge's face remained an unreadable mask of absolute authority as the guilty plea was formally entered into the record, ensuring that the individual who had dug that dark hole in 2006 would spend the remainder of their natural life behind the concrete walls of a maximum security state penitentiary. The true impact of the resolution, however, was felt not in the courthouse but within the quiet confines of the North Phoenix neighborhood where the crime had lain buried for so long. The current owners of the property, who had purchased the home years after the foreclosure without any knowledge of its dark history, faced the agonizing task of reclaiming their living space from the taint of violence. The backyard excavation site was eventually filled back in with fresh, clean topsoil. The old mesquite tree was cut down, its roots removed from the earth where they had wrapped around the plastic tarp for 20 years. A quiet, solemn memorial service was held by the neighborhood association on the sidewalk outside the home, a small gathering of candles, flowers, and framed photographs meant to finally bring peace to a spirit that had been denied a proper resting place for 2 decades. The heavy, suffocating silence that had hung over the block since that hot July night in 2006 was finally replaced by a collective sigh of relief, a sense of closure that had seemed impossible for a generation. Yet, the lingering questions surrounding the anonymous tip that triggered the entire discovery continued to hover over the case like a persistent desert mist. Investigators kept the identity of the caller completely shielded, refusing to confirm whether the information came from a remorseful confidant, a deathbed confession, or a digital breakthrough that had traced an old communication log. The mystery of the phone call added a final, cinematic layer of intrigue to the entire saga, a reminder that secrets have a way of rotting from the inside out until they inevitably burst into the light of day. True crime analysts and documentary crews descended on the neighborhood, their cameras capturing the clean asphalt and the standard-issue suburban facades that had hidden a nightmare for 20 years. The case became a legendary example of forensic persistence, a story told in academy classrooms to remind young officers that a file is never truly dead as long as the earth holds the physical truth of the crime. As the weeks passed, the news cameras packed up their tripods, the satellite trucks pulled away from the curb, and the block finally fell back into the routine rhythms of suburban life. The children returned to their bicycles, the garage doors opened and closed with mechanical regularity, and the intense summer heat returned to bake the Arizona clay once again. But the memory of the backyard burial remained etched into the collective consciousness of the valley, a chilling reminder that the line between suburban peace and absolute horror is often just a few inches of dry dirt. The story of the Phoenix 2006 cold case would be passed down through families, a cautionary tale whispered on dark porches when the desert wind blew through the trees, reminding everyone that the past is never truly dead, it is merely waiting for the right moment to rise. The final, absolute closure of the record books came on a quiet winter afternoon when the victims' remains were formally laid to rest in a historical cemetery in the foothills of the valley, surrounded by green grass and the dignified respect of a proper burial. The headstone, carved from heavy gray granite, bore the name and the dates that had been missing from the world for 20 years, a permanent physical anchor that marked the end of a long, agonizing journey through the dark. The case file was officially moved to the Dead Storage Archives of the Phoenix Police Department, its tabs marked with the definitive stamp of a successful closure, joining the ranks of resolved mysteries that define the history of the city. The dynamic of the North Phoenix block had changed forever, stripped of its innocence, but gifted with a hard-won piece of the truth, a community that had stared directly into the face of a 20-year horror and watched it finally dissolve into the light. The immediate response to that chilling anonymous tip required a tactical precision that the Phoenix Police Department had not applied to this specific address in precisely 20 years. The transition from a forgotten cold case file collecting dust in the digital archives to an active, high-priority excavation zone occurred in less than 60 minutes. The calm, standard afternoon rhythm of the North Phoenix suburb was permanently shattered as a convoy of unmarked Ford Explorers, heavy-duty forensic support vans, and a mobile command unit tore through the residential grid, their tires biting sharply into the sun-baked asphalt before coming to a sudden halt outside the single-story stucco home. Detectives leaped from their vehicles, their expressions hardened by the grim reality of the mission, and instantly began stringing bright yellow crime scene tape across the perimeter, sealing off the driveway, the front yard, and the narrow side alleyways that led to the rear of the property. The neighbors, drawn out by the sudden roar of engines and the authority of the police presence, stepped onto their driveways, their eyes wide with confusion as the yellow tape was tied to the stop sign at the corner, creating an absolute exclusion zone that effectively isolated the block from the rest of the city. The immediate focus of the operation shifted entirely to the backyard, the specific coordinate named by the flat-tone caller as the final resting place of the victim who had vanished in July of 2006. The current occupants of the home, an ordinary family who had rented the property years after the initial foreclosure without any inkling of its dark history, were escorted past the perimeter in a state of absolute shock, their daily lives instantly derailed by the intrusion of a 20-year-old nightmare. Once the house was cleared, a specialized team of forensic anthropologists and underground imaging specialists from the State University marched through the side gate, carrying advanced ground-penetrating radar arrays and specialized soil core sampling gear. The backyard was a typical desert landscape, hard-packed caliche clay, patches of stubborn gravel, and a massive, ancient mesquite tree whose sprawling branches cast long, distorted shadows across the dry ground. The radar operators calibrated their equipment, the digital screens humming with a low-frequency pulse as they began rolling the sensor units back and forth across the Earth in a highly disciplined grid pattern, tracking the density of the subterranean layers to identify any structural disruptions beneath the surface. For the first 2 hours, the radar readouts showed nothing but the natural, undisturbed geological stratigraphy of the Arizona desert, dense layers of gravel and solid clay that had remained unchanged for centuries. The tension within the perimeter grew heavy, the intense afternoon heat radiating off the stucco walls of the house as the detectives paced the perimeter, wondering if the anonymous phone call had been nothing more than a cruel hoax designed to waste city resources and reopen old wounds. But at exactly 2:45 p.m., as the radar unit approached the massive trunk of the mesquite tree, the digital display suddenly spiked, indicating a massive, unnatural anomaly located precisely 5.5 feet below the surface. The soil profile in that exact spot had been violently disrupted. The natural compression of the clay was completely broken, replaced by a distinct, vertical pit that had been dug out and backfilled years prior. The anthropologists knelt in the dirt, marking the boundaries of the anomaly with small red flags, their professional intuition instantly confirming that the shape appearing on the high-contrast digital monitor bore the distinct, unmistakable dimensions of a hidden human burial. The mobile command unit immediately requested additional support, bringing in a heavy excavation team equipped with specialized hand tools, fine mesh sifting screens, and a massive black privacy tent designed to completely shield the yard from the news helicopters that were already beginning to circle overhead. The technical process of unearthing a 20-year-old grave in the desert heat requires an agonizingly slow, layer-by-layer methodology to ensure that no microtraces of forensic evidence are destroyed by the tools. The specialists stripped away the top layer of gravel and loose topsoil, exposing the hard-packed caliche clay beneath, which showed distinct tool marks, the faint, preserved impressions of a standard square-nosed shovel that had been driven into the earth by a desperate killer in the dead of night. Every single bucket of dirt removed from the pit was carried over to the sifting stations, where technicians manually forced the dry soil through wire screens, searching for foreign objects, personal effects, or clothing fibers that had survived the long passage of time. As the afternoon light began to turn a deep, blood red against the western sky, the excavation depth reached nearly 4 feet, and the physical atmosphere inside the privacy tent changed dramatically. The dry, dusty smell of the upper earth was suddenly replaced by a heavy, dense moisture, a distinct chemical scent that caused the lead anthropologist to halt the shovels and transition entirely to delicate hand trowels and fine brushes. Working with microscopic precision, the team cleared away a dense shelf of clay, revealing the dull, gray surface of a heavy-duty, industrial-grade plastic tarp that had been tightly wrapped and bound with multiple layers of silver duct tape. The synthetic material, though coated in mineral deposits and stained by 2 decades of subterranean pressure, had successfully resisted decomposition, maintaining its structural integrity against the harsh, acidic nature of the desert soil. The detectives standing at the edge of the pit held their breath as the camera crew lowered their equipment to document the exact positioning of the bundle, the grim contours beneath the plastic leaving absolutely no doubt that the search for the missing person of 2006 had finally come to an end. The discovery sent an immediate, low-frequency shockwave through the communication channels of the Phoenix Police Department, triggering the immediate deployment of the primary crime scene unit and the medical examiner's transport vehicle. The physical extraction of the wrapped remains from the compact clay was a complex engineering challenge, requiring the team to dig a wide trench completely around the anomaly to lift the entire structural block without causing the fragile internal components to shift or degrade. The light inside the tent was provided by high-intensity halogen arrays that cast a stark, white glare over the gray plastic bundle, highlighting the precise manner in which the duct tape had been wound around the head and feet, a meticulous, highly organized effort to prevent any scent or fluid from escaping into the upper atmosphere where neighbors might notice. When the bundle was finally freed from the earth, it was placed onto a heavy aluminum gurney, sealed within an insulated transport bag, and wheeled out through the side gate under the watchful eyes of a silent, stunned crowd of residents who had gathered along the sidewalk to witness the extraction of the secret that had lived beneath their feet for 20 years. The scene shifted instantly from the physical dirt of the North Phoenix backyard to the sterile, stainless steel reality of the county morgue, where a multidisciplinary team of forensic pathologists, odontologists, and DNA specialists waited to conduct the formal postmortem examination. The removal of the outer plastic layers was performed under high-resolution video documentation, each turn of the ancient duct tape carefully sliced away to preserve any latent biological material or manufacturing stamps that might trace the materials back to a specific retail outlet from 2006. As the final layer of tarp was peeled back, the structural reality of the crime was laid bare under the bright surgical lamps. The skeletal remains were remarkably well preserved, the intense aridity of the desert clay having partially mummified the underlying tissue structures. The victim's clothing, a faded summer shirt and denim shorts, remained largely intact, the pockets still containing minor personal items, including a digital wristwatch whose battery had died precisely 20 years ago, its internal mechanism frozen like a time capsule at the exact moment the nightmare began. The trauma analysis began immediately, with a forensic pathologist tracing the structural integrity of the skeletal framework to determine the precise cause and mechanism of death. It did not take long to locate the definitive strike zone. The posterior aspect of the cranium exhibited a massive, radiating fracture pattern consistent with a severe, high-velocity impact from a heavy, blunt instrument applied from behind. The force of the blow had been so immense that it had instantly shattered the thickest part of the bone, causing immediate cessation of neurological function before the victim could even attempt a defensive posture or cry out for help. There were no other defensive wounds on the arms or hands, no fractured ribs to indicate a prolonged struggle within the house, confirming the theory that this was a sudden, predatory execution executed in absolute silence within the privacy of the home before the body was dragged out to the pre-dug pit beneath the mesquite tree. While the medical examiner worked to compile the physical profile of the violence, the digital forensics unit at the state laboratory was already initiating the rapid DNA sequencing protocol to secure a definitive, legally unassailable identification of the remains. Because the biological samples had been protected from moisture and sunlight by the heavy plastic wrapping, the lab technicians were able to extract a pristine genomic profile in less than 12 hours, a process that would have taken weeks during the initial 2006 investigation. The resulting DNA sequence was uploaded directly into the state missing persons database, where it triggered an immediate, high-priority system match with the original case file opened 2 decades prior. The red text flashing on the analyst's screen confirmed what the detectives had known the moment the radar spiked: the long, agonizing search for the individual who had vanished into the July heatwave was over, transforming the historical disappearance into an active, live-target homicide investigation with a concrete body and a defined crime scene. The public announcement of the identification hit the valley's media streams like a concussive blast, completely disrupting the standard news cycle with flashing red banners and breaking live reports broadcast directly from the sidewalk outside the North Phoenix home. The community response was immediate and visceral. The neighborhood group chats and local social media forums erupted with a mixture of terror, disbelief, and intense speculation as residents struggled to process the reality of the backyard burial. People who had lived on the block for 20 years, who had raised children and hosted block parties just yards from that mesquite tree, were suddenly forced to confront the fact that they had shared their quiet suburban paradise with a hidden grave. The psychological safety of the entire community evaporated overnight, replaced by an oppressive, lingering paranoia as the focus of the homicide task force shifted aggressively toward the identity of the person who had held the deed to that house during the dark summer of 2006. The momentum of the newly reactivated homicide investigation shifted instantly from the physical dirt of the North Phoenix backyard to the cold, digital paper trail left behind in the county records archives. The primary objective for the task force was absolute. They needed to reconstruct the complete operational history of the property during the summer of 2006, tracking every name, every financial transaction, and every signature associated with the deed. Detectives pulled the historical microfilms and digital transaction logs from the Maricopa County Recorder's Office, mapping out a highly erratic financial timeline that perfectly aligned with the timeline of the victim's disappearance. The records revealed that the property had been hastily transferred through a series of quitclaim deeds just weeks after the July Vanishing Act, an aggressive maneuver designed to rapidly obscure the primary ownership structure before the banking institutions could initiate foreclosure proceedings. The individual holding the primary mortgage during that fateful summer was a man named Raymond Vance, no relation to the victim, but a transient real estate speculator who had used a network of shell identities to acquire multiple suburban properties during the peak of the mid-2000s housing bubble. Vance was a phantom in the system. His credit profiles were littered with conflicting addresses, disconnected phone numbers, and cross-state vehicle registrations that suggested a life lived perpetually on the run. A deep-dive audit of his financial records from July 2006 showed a sudden, violent cessation of all local economic activity within 48 hours of the estimated time of death. His local bank accounts were cleared out via ATM withdrawals in the middle of the night, his utilities were abruptly disconnected for non-payment, and his primary vehicle, a dark gray 2004 Chevrolet Tahoe, vanished completely from the state registration system, never to be scanned by an Arizona license plate reader again. As the detectives constructed the historical profile of Raymond Vance, they began interviewing the original investigators who had handled the initial missing person report in 2006. The retired detectives, now gray-haired and removed from the daily grid of the force, sat in the modern interrogation rooms, looking through their old, yellowed field notes with a sense of grim vindication. They revealed that Vance had been briefly questioned during the first week of the disappearance, but he had presented a flawless, highly polished alibi, claiming he was out of town on a scouting trip in the mountains of Flagstaff when the victim went missing. In 2006, without a body, without a defined crime scene, and without the advanced tracking metrics of the modern era, the police simply lacked the legal leverage to secure a search warrant for the backyard. Vance had played the system perfectly, leveraging the chaotic nature of the real estate crash to slip through the dragnet before anyone realized a murder had even taken place. The modern task force, armed with the physical reality of the unearthed skeletal remains and the concussive trauma report from the medical examiner, had no intention of letting the trail go cold again. They deployed advanced data mining algorithms to trace Vance's digital shadow across the country over the last 20 years, tracking Social Security utilization, historical tax filings, and low-level credit applications that had long since bypassed the radar of traditional law enforcement tracking. The digital net began to tighten around a specific geographical coordinate in the Midwest, a decaying industrial suburb just outside Chicago, Illinois. The data indicated that an individual matching Vance's physical description and birth date was currently living under the alias of Arthur Pendleton, operating a small, cash-only automotive repair shop near the rail yards, entirely insulated from the high-tech surveillance systems of the modern corporate world. The tactical coordination between the Phoenix Homicide Division and the Chicago field office of the FBI moved with absolute secrecy, ensuring that no leak could alert the suspect to the sudden resurrection of his 20-year-old crime. Surveillance teams were deployed to the Chicago suburb, setting up low-profile observation posts in unmarked utility vans equipped with long-range telephoto lenses and facial recognition scanners. For 3 days, they monitored the rhythms of the automotive repair shop, capturing high-resolution images of an aging man with deeply lined skin, gray hair, and a distinct, heavy limp that matched a historical medical record found in Raymond Vance's military file. The target was living a quiet, entirely microscopic existence, never crossing state lines, never applying for traditional bank accounts, and relying completely on a cash economy to maintain his invisibility. On the fourth morning of surveillance, as a heavy, freezing Midwestern fog rolled off Lake Michigan, the tactical teams received the final, federal execution order for the arrest warrant. A convoy of armored vehicles swerved into the gravel lot of the automotive shop, their strobe lights piercing the gray mist as heavily armed agents breached the bay doors with absolute speed and violence of action. The suspect was caught completely off guard, a half-rusted wrench slipping from his grease-stained hands as he was driven into the concrete floor by the weight of 3 tactical officers. There was no theatrical resistance, no desperate attempt to reach for a hidden weapon. There was only the sharp, metallic crunch of steel handcuffs locking around his wrists and the sudden, total deflation of a man who realized that his 44-year life of deception had just collided with the unyielding reality of the law. During the immediate transport to the federal holding facility, Vance remained completely silent, his eyes fixed on the reinforced mesh screen of the transport cage, refusing to acknowledge the statements or the presence of the agents. The arrogance that had allowed him to live above a hidden grave for weeks before fleeing the state had hardened into a cold, defensive shell. But back in Phoenix, the legal team was already preparing the comprehensive extradition package, using the absolute match of the rapid DNA sequencing and the physical evidence recovered from the backyard sifting screens to ensure that no technicality could prevent his return to the desert to face judgment. The community he had left behind was waiting. The media vans were still parked along the suburban curb, and the machinery of justice was moving at a velocity that the old killer could neither outrun nor comprehend. The extradition was approved by a federal judge within 48 hours, and Raymond Vance was placed onto a secure state transport plane, chained hand and foot, escorted by 2 veteran Phoenix homicide detectives who had sworn to see the case through to its absolute conclusion. As the aircraft descended into the shimmering heat wave of the valley, the suspect looked out the window at the sprawling grid of Phoenix, the very city where he had dug a dark hole beneath a mesquite tree 20 years before, believing the dry clay would keep his secret forever. The plane touched down on the tarmac of the secure military terminal, where a high-security convoy waited to transfer the aging fugitive directly to the Maricopa County Jail, officially closing the loop on a cross-country flight from justice that had lasted a generation, and setting the stage for a final, public accounting of the horror that had lain hidden in the dirt. The heavy steel doors of the Maricopa County Jail slammed shut with a definitive, metallic echo, locking Raymond Vance into the very jurisdiction he had spent 2 decades desperately outrunning. The booking process was an exercise in sterile efficiency. His civilian clothes were stripped away, his identifiers were logged into the modern digital system, and his fingers were pressed against glass biometric scanners that instantly linked his physical body to the 2006 case file. By the time he was led into the high-security interrogation wing the following morning, the atmosphere in the precinct had reached a fever pitch of anticipation. The primary interrogation room was cold, lit by harsh, unyielding fluorescent panels that cast deep shadows under the eyes of the two veteran detectives waiting at the metal table. They did not begin with aggressive posturing or loud accusations. Instead, they sat in absolute silence, methodically arranging a series of large, high-definition forensic photographs across the scratched metallic surface, directly in Vance's line of sight. The images were a brutal, unedited timeline of his uncovered past. The first photograph showed the pristine, suburban exterior of the North Phoenix home as it looked during the 2006 investigation, a scene frozen in time before the housing market collapsed. The subsequent photos shifted down into the dirt, documenting the progressive, forensic dismantling of the backyard, the ground-penetrating radar anomalies, the first glimpse of the gray industrial plastic tarp, and finally, the stark, undeniable reality of the skeletal remains resting in the caliche clay beneath the roots of the mesquite tree. The final image in the sequence was a high-contrast medical print of the victim's skull, highlighting the massive, radiating fracture lines caused by the blunt force impact that had ended the young life. Vance stared at the table, his face a calculated mask of absolute indifference, his jaw tightened as he attempted to maintain the psychological armor that had protected his alias in the Midwest for 20 years. For the first hour, the interrogation was a battle of absolute endurance. The detective spoke in low, measured tones, tracing the historical movement of his finances, the fraudulent quitclaim deeds he had signed, and the exact path of his 2006 Chevrolet Tahoe as it fled across the state line into New Mexico and beyond. They laid out the modern genomic data, explaining with clinical precision how the rapid DNA sequencing left 0% doubt regarding the identity of the remains found in his former yard. Vance remained completely silent, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his eyes fixed on a scratch near the center of the table, as if he could simply tune out the reality of the room. He was relying on the old rules of criminal defense, believing that without an eyewitness or a recovered murder weapon, the state's case was entirely circumstantial, a historical puzzle that a skilled attorney could dismantle in front of a jury. But the detectives had saved their most concussive piece of evidence for the final act of the session. One of the investigators reached into a secure evidence briefcase and pulled out a heavy, clear plastic bag containing a physical object recovered from the very bottom of the backyard burial pit during the final sifting process. It was a heavy, commercial-grade iron pry bar, stained with the dark, chemical signatures of long-term soil burial, but still bearing distinct, preserved tool marks along its edge. The detective placed the bagged weapon directly on top of the photographs, leaning forward until he was inches from the suspect's face, his voice dropping to a harsh, steady whisper. He revealed that modern forensic laboratories had advanced far beyond the capabilities of 2006. Specialized vacuum-assisted DNA retrieval systems had successfully extracted an undeniable skin cell profile from the textured grip of the iron bar, a profile that matched Raymond Vance's genetic signature down to a scientific certainty. The reaction was instantaneous. The absolute arrogance that had sustained the aging fugitive through his capture in Chicago and his cross-country extradition evaporated in a fraction of a second. The color drained from Vance's weathered face, his hands began to tremble slightly against the fabric of his orange jumpsuit, and his breathing became shallow and erratic as the absolute weight of the evidence crushed his remaining defenses. He looked away from the plastic bag, his eyes darting toward the corners of the room as if searching for an escape from the mathematical reality that his own biological footprint had survived 20 years in the dark earth to destroy him. The silence in the room stretched out, heavy and suffocating, until the suspect finally leaned forward, resting his forehead against his folded hands, and let out a long, ragged sigh that signaled the absolute collapse of his decades-long deception. When he finally began to speak, his voice was a low, gravelly rasp that required the detectives to lean closer to capture every word on the digital audio recorders. The narrative that emerged was not one of a calculated, mastermind execution, but a chaotic, terrifying descent into domestic rage and immediate, panicked concealment. Vance recounted the volatile argument that had erupted inside the living room of the North Phoenix home on that suffocating July night in 2006, fueled by financial desperation and personal betrayals as the local real estate market began to crumble around them. The dispute had escalated rapidly, moving from screamed insults to physical confrontation, until Vance, consumed by a sudden, blinding fury, had reached for the heavy iron pry bar resting near the garage door and struck a single, catastrophic blow from behind as the victim turned to walk away. The description of the immediate aftermath was delivered with a chilling, detached precision that sent a shiver through the seasoned homicide detectives. Vance described standing over the unmoving form in the center of the dark living room, the television still humming in the background as the reality of what he had done began to penetrate his panic. Realizing that his life, his career, and his freedom were forfeit if the body was discovered, he immediately initiated a frantic, multi-hour effort to erase the crime before the sun rose over the valley. He walked out into the oppressive night air of the backyard, using the heavy iron tool and a square-nosed shovel to laboriously dig into the hard-packed, concrete-like caliche clay beneath the sprawling branches of the mesquite tree, working until his hands were raw and bleeding from the effort. Once the pit had reached a depth of nearly 6 feet, he returned to the house, wrapped the victim tightly in a heavy-duty industrial drop cloth he had purchased for a home renovation project, and secured the bundle with multiple rolls of duct tape to ensure no fluids or scent could escape to alert the neighbors. He dragged the heavy remains across the concrete patio under the cover of the moonless night, lowered the bundle into the earth, and threw the murder weapon into the bottom of the grave before backfilling the hole with the displaced clay and gravel. To ensure the surface looked natural, he meticulously raked the desert landscape, scattering loose gravel and fallen leaves over the disturbed earth until the grave was completely invisible to anyone standing just feet away. The entire confession was captured on high-definition video, a definitive, self-incriminating record that effectively brought the 20-year investigation to its technical resolution, ensuring that the legal proceedings to follow would be a swift, unyielding march toward absolute justice. The recorded confession of Raymond Vance hung in the sterile air of the interrogation wing like an absolute, irreversible verdict, providing the definitive blueprint for the next phase of the operation. The Homicide Task Force, while vindicated by the breakthrough, knew that a verbal admission was merely the skeleton of a successful prosecution. They needed to back every sentence of Vance's confession with hard, empirical data before the formal arraignment could begin. Within minutes of the interrogation concluding, a secondary team of crime scene technicians was dispatched back to the North Phoenix home, armed with advanced chemical reagents and high-intensity alternate light sources designed to uncover biological traces that had survived 20 years of routine household cleaning. The focus of this secondary forensic sweep shifted entirely to the interior living room, the precise location Vance had identified as the strike zone. The modern technicians sealed the windows with heavy black plastic, plunging the space into absolute darkness before spraying the walls, the baseboards, and the subflooring with a highly sensitive luminol compound. As the alternate light sources were activated, the room suddenly erupted in a glowing, iridescent blue map of long-hidden violence. The chemical reaction exposed distinct, heavy patterns of high-velocity blood spatter that had soaked deep into the porous concrete foundation beneath the modern carpeting, matching the exact height and trajectory of the fatal blow described in Vance's confession. The killer had meticulously scrubbed the surface 2 decades prior, but the biological footprint had traveled downward, locked away out of sight until modern science pulled it back into the light. Simultaneously, financial analysts attached to the Arizona Attorney General's office began a forensic audit of the historical banking records Vance had mentioned during his breakdown. They successfully recovered archived server logs from July 2006, tracking the precise ATM transactions that had cleared out his liquid assets in the hours immediately following the murder. The digital timestamps provided an undeniable chronological anchor, placing Vance at a drive-up teller window just 3 miles from the crime scene at 3:14 a.m. on the night of the disappearance, exactly 40 minutes after he had finished backfilling the grave beneath the mesquite tree. The paper trail, combined with the glowing blue map of the living room floor, effectively dismantled any potential strategy the defense could use to claim the confession was coerced or structurally inaccurate. Outside the precinct walls, the media frenzy reached a boiling point as the Maricopa County Prosecutor's Office announced a formal press conference to address the filing of first-degree murder charges. The lobby of the downtown courthouse was packed to absolute capacity, a wall of high-definition cameras and microphones bristling as the lead prosecutor stepped to the podium. The language used in the official briefing was sharp, dap, and designed to send a clear message. The state would accept no plea bargains, no reduced sentences, and no mitigating circumstances. The presentation displayed the timeline of the 2006 cold case side by side with the modern forensic findings, demonstrating to the public how an anonymous tip and rapid DNA technology had completely shattered a 20-year illusion of safety. The public reaction across the Phoenix Valley was a volatile mix of relief and deep, lingering discomfort. The realization that a murderer had successfully integrated into a major Midwestern city under a stolen identity for 2 decades highlighted the terrifying gaps that had existed in the pre-digital law enforcement networks of the early 2000s. In the North Phoenix neighborhood, the block remained a highly restricted zone, the yellow tape fluttering in the hot desert wind as technicians continued to carry evidence bags out of the house. The residents, paralyzed by the constant stream of breaking news banners on their phones, began to look at their own properties with a new sense of unease, wondering what other secrets might be buried just beneath the surface of the quiet, manicured suburban landscape. In the county jail's maximum security wing, Raymond Vance was placed under an intensive 24-hour suicide watch, isolated from the general population to ensure his physical survival before the trial. He sat on the edge of a concrete bunk, stripped of his personal belongings and dressed in a high-visibility smock, staring blankly at the solid steel door of his cell. The tactical arrogance that had sustained him through decades of hiding in Chicago had been entirely replaced by a hollow, catatonic shock. He had believed the desert earth was a permanent accomplice, an unyielding vault that would hold his secret forever, but he had failed to calculate the relentless progression of time and the mathematical certainty of modern forensic science. The legal machinery was now operating at a velocity that left the defense team completely overwhelmed. The prosecutor's office filed a motion for expedited discovery, dumping thousands of pages of genomic readouts, chemical spatter analyses, and digital financial tracking data onto the defense table. Every single piece of evidence pointed toward a single, unavoidable conclusion. Raymond Vance had executed a defenseless individual in cold blood, buried the body like garbage in his own backyard, and used the chaos of a national real estate crash to slip away into the night. The stage was now set for the formal preliminary hearing, a high-stakes legal confrontation that would officially transition the 2006 cold case from a forgotten police file into an unyielding, permanent record of absolute justice. The formal filing of first-degree murder charges triggered an immediate, high-security legal sequence within the Maricopa County Superior Court, shifting the battleground from the physical dirt of the North Phoenix backyard to the cold, adversarial arena of constitutional law. The preliminary hearing was scheduled under an expedited mandate, drawn up by a prosecution team determined to lock down the case before the defense could mount a protracted campaign of procedural delays. The downtown courthouse became an impenetrable fortress of security barricades and media trucks, the air vibrating with the hum of broadcast generators as journalists from across the nation jockeyed for limited seating inside the gallery. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick, almost suffocating, as the victims' surviving family members took their places in the front row, their eyes locked onto the heavy wooden door through which the suspect would emerge. When Raymond Vance was led into the room, the transition in his physical demeanor was absolute. Stripped of the protective anonymity he had enjoyed for 20 years in Chicago, He looked visibly withered under the harsh courtroom lights, his wrists tightly bound by heavy steel transport chains that clanked rhythmically against his orange jumpsuit with every step. He kept his gaze fixed firmly on the defense table, refusing to look at the gallery or the banks of cameras capturing his every movement. His defense counsel, a team of aggressive, high-stakes public defenders, immediately filed a motion to suppress the recorded confession, arguing desperately that the length of the cross-country transport and the high-pressure environment of the modern interrogation wing had crossed the line into psychological coercion. The prosecution, however, was prepared for the predictable counter-strategy. The lead district attorney stood before the bench, her voice projecting a sharp, uncompromising clarity that dominated the room. Instead of engaging in a long rhetorical debate about the suspect's state of mind, she simply introduced a series of objective, time-stamped digital logs from the interrogation room's automated recording system. The data proved that Vance had been read his constitutional rights multiple times, had been provided regular breaks, and had initiated the confession voluntarily the exact moment he was confronted with the physical reality of the iron pry bar. The judge reviewed the logs for less than 5 minutes before denying the defense motion with a sharp rap of his gavel, establishing a permanent legal baseline that the confession was fully admissible and structurally unassailable. With the confession firmly secured, the prosecution began entering the core forensic evidence into the record, building a massive, empirical wall that left no room for reasonable doubt. The state's primary witness was the chief forensic anthropologist who had directed the backyard excavation beneath the mesquite tree. Taking the stand with a calm, clinical authority, she projected high-resolution digital models of the grave site onto the courtroom screens, detailing the precise, layer-by-layer extraction process. She explained to the court how the hard-packed caliche clay had acted as a natural preservation vault, trapping the microtraces of evidence that a more porous soil would have destroyed over 2 decades. The most damning moment of her testimony came when she presented the physical analysis of the iron pry bar recovered from the bottom of the pit. Using advanced microscopic imaging, she demonstrated how the distinct tool marks on the rusted metal matched the catastrophic fracture patterns on the victim's skull down to a fraction of a millimeter. The defense attempted a desperate cross-examination, questioning whether the skin cell DNA extracted from the textured grip could have been deposited through secondary transfer or contamination during the excavation process. The anthropologist dismantled the argument instantly, stating that the vacuum-assisted DNA retrieval system had isolated deep, compressed biological material within the metal's grooves, a profile that could only be generated by a high-friction, forceful grip consistent with delivering a fatal blow. As the physical evidence mounted, the financial analysts took the stand to map out the digital trail of Vance's flight from justice in July 2006. They presented the newly recovered server logs showing the rapid liquidation of his assets and the sudden abandonment of the property to foreclosure. The timeline was seamless. The murder, the midnight excavation, the ATM withdrawals, and the immediate cross-state flight were all linked by a single, unbroken chain of digital and physical footprints. The defense sat in absolute silence, their yellow legal pads covered in frantic, crossed-out notes as each of their potential avenues of escape was systematically sealed off by the state's presentation. By the end of the second day of the preliminary hearing, the structural reality of the case was clear to everyone in the room. The judge leaned forward over the bench, his expression one of grim certainty as he looked down at the defense table. He ruled that the state had presented more than sufficient probable cause to bind Raymond Vance over for a full criminal trial on charges of first-degree murder, concealment of a corpse, and grand theft. The trial date was set for the winter, ensuring that the individual who had believed his secret was buried forever would face the ultimate, public accounting that the community had been denied for 20 years. As Vance was led back to the transport van, the clanking of his chains served as a stark, rhythmic reminder that the long journey toward absolute justice was entering its final, unyielding phase. The winter wind of 2026 cut sharply through the downtown plaza as the Maricopa County Superior Court convened for the formal commencement of the state of Arizona versus Raymond Vance. The transition from the preliminary hearings to the absolute finality of a capital trial brought an oppressive, hyper-focused energy to the third-floor courtroom. Every available seat in the public gallery had been claimed hours before the first gavel strike, populated by a tense mix of international media correspondents, legal analysts, and a quiet, unified contingent of the original 2006 neighborhood residents. The courtroom's heavy mahogany doors remained closed to the bustling corridors outside, creating an isolated crucible where the mechanics of American justice would finally dissect a 20-year-old horror. When the bailiff called the court to order, the primary prosecution team moved with a structured, aggressive economy of motion. The lead prosecutor stood before the jury box, her opening statement delivering a sharp, rhythmic narrative that completely bypassed traditional emotional appeals, focusing instead on the cold, mathematical certainty of the evidence. She painted a stark picture of the hot July night in 2006, contrasting the violent, panicked actions of a desperate man with the quiet, suburban peace he had shattered. She laid out the structural framework of the state's case, telling the jurors that they would not be asked to guess, assume, or infer, but rather to simply read the permanent biological and digital script that the defendant had left behind in the clay. The defense countered with an opening strategy that attempted to exploit the sheer passage of time, framing the case as a historical puzzle whose pieces had been degraded, contaminated, or warped by a 20-year vacuum. They urged the jury to question the reliability of memories that had aged 2 decades, the potential for contamination in a backyard that had changed hands multiple times, and the absolute validity of an anonymous tip whose origin remained completely hidden from public view. The defense attorney paced the length of the rail, his voice filled with calculated skepticism as he attempted to plant the seeds of reasonable doubt before the first piece of physical evidence could be officially entered into the record. The state's first witness of the trial phase brought the technical reality of the crime scene directly into the box. The lead field technician from the 2026 Crime Scene Unit took the stand, presenting the highly specialized digital scans of the living room's concrete subflooring. The high-resolution images displayed on the courtroom screens showed the distinct, glowing blue maps generated by the modern luminol arrays, a permanent, indelible record of the high-velocity impact that had ended the victim's life. The technician explained under oath that while the surface carpet and padding had been replaced during the subsequent foreclosure and renovation cycles, the biological material had seeped deep into the microscopic pores of the foundation, remaining completely shielded from UV light, air currents, and standard domestic cleaning agents. As the technical testimony progressed into the late afternoon, the prosecution introduced the core digital evidence that pinned Raymond Vance to the exact chronology of the murder. A senior data analyst from the Federal Banking Task Force presented the verified server logs from the night of the disappearance, detailing the exact sequence of financial transactions that occurred in the early morning hours. The digital records proved that Vance's personal debit card had been utilized at a drive-up automated teller machine just 3 miles from the residence at precisely 3:14 a.m., a time frame that perfectly intersected with the estimated window of death and the frantic backyard excavation. The defense attempted aggressive cross-examination, demanding to know if the system could verify the exact identity of the individual inserting the card, but the analyst countered instantly with the concurrent traffic camera logs that captured the distinct silhouette of a 2004 Chevrolet Tahoe idling at the teller window. The emotional weight of the trial reached a critical peak on the 3rd day when the prosecution called the victim's closest relative to the stand. The aging witness spoke in low, measured tones, recounting the agonizing weeks of silence that followed the sudden July disappearance, the dismissive initial assumptions that it was a temporary departure, and the slow, agonizing realization that something terrible had occurred behind those closed blinds. The testimony provided a vital human context to the mountain of forensic data, reminding the courtroom that the skeletal remains unearthed from the caliche clay belonged to a living, breathing individual whose future had been violently erased by an act of absolute domestic rage. Raymond Vance sat at the defense table throughout the grueling presentations, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed permanently on the legal documents stacked before him. The calculated, Midwestern anonymity he had cultivated as Arthur Pendleton had been completely stripped away, leaving an aging, broken man facing the unyielding weight of his past. The defense team worked frantically to find a crack in the state's forensic wall, launching procedural objections and challenging the chains of custody for every evidence bag brought into the room. But the judge overruled each motion with a swift, definitive authority that kept the trial moving at a punishing velocity. The day concluded with the formal introduction of the suspect's recorded confession video, the high-definition monitors displaying Vance's own face as he described the frantic, late-night excavation beneath the mesquite tree while the rest of the neighborhood slept. The sound of his low, trembling voice echoed through the silent courtroom, providing the definitive, self-incriminating closure to the state's narrative. The jurors watched the screens with intense, unblinking focus, their expressions hardening into a collective look of grim certainty that signaled the absolute collapse of the defense's strategy and set the stage for the final, unyielding march toward a verdict. The transition into the second week of the trial marked the definitive pivot from the state's forensic timeline to the highly anticipated cross-examination of the medical examiner. The courtroom configuration remained tight and hyper-focused, the air within the third-floor space growing increasingly heavy as the technical details of the post-mortem analysis were prepared for formal entry into the permanent judicial record. Dr. Eris Thorne, the chief forensic pathologist who had overseen the comprehensive examination at the county morgue, took the stand under a collective, breathless silence from the gallery. Dressed in a sharp, dark suit that contrasted with the clinical severity of his daily work, he adjusted the microphone before him, his expression an unreadable mask of academic authority. The prosecution wastefully spent no time on introductory rhetoric, immediately directing the pathologist to walk the jury through the structural reality of the trauma discovered within the excavated grave. High-resolution digital renderings of the skull were projected onto the large monitors flanking the jury box, displaying the complex, radiating fracture lines that scarred the posterior cranial vault. Dr. Thorne utilized a laser pointer to trace the absolute epicenter of the impact, demonstrating how the force of the blow had driven bone fragments inward, causing instantaneous and catastrophic disruption to the central nervous system. The language used in his testimony was short, precise, and entirely devoid of emotional coloring. He described the mechanism of death not as a tragedy, but as a high-velocity transfer of kinetic energy from a dense, flat-edged iron instrument into living tissue. The defense team immediately launched an aggressive, multi-pronged counter-strategy during their turn at the podium, attempting to exploit the decades-long passage of time to cloud the pathologist's conclusions. The lead defense attorney stepped toward the witness stand, holding a thick stack of historical meteorological data from July 2006, arguing that the extreme, triple-digit desert heat waves of that summer could have accelerated subterranean decomposition to a point where the bone fractures were caused by the natural compression of the shifting caliche clay rather than a human hand. The attorney leaned heavily against a rail, his voice filled with calculated skepticism as he suggested that the iron pry bar found at the bottom of the pit had simply settled against the remains over 20 years of seasonal soil expansion. Dr. Thorne did not flinch under the pressure of the defense's confrontational tone. He waited for the attorney to finish his long, hypothetical prompt before adjusting his glasses and addressing the jury directly. He explained that the physical properties of blunt force trauma on living bone are radically distinct from the post-mortem damage caused by environmental pressure or geological shifting. The internal margins of the fractures exhibited distinct signs of perimortem staining, a biological phenomenon that only occurs when blood is actively pumping through the bone at the exact moment of impact. The caliche clay, while dense, could never duplicate the specific, localized compression metrics left behind by a commercial-grade iron tool driven by a high-velocity human strike. The defense's theory of natural degradation was dismantled in less than 2 minutes, leaving their structural narrative visibly fractured in front of the silent jurors. The prosecution reinforced this scientific victory by introducing the advanced digital mapping data generated by the state's Forensic Engineering Unit. A technician took the stand to present a three-dimensional computer simulation that reconstructed the final moments inside the North Phoenix living room, matching the location of the luminol-stained blood spatter on the concrete foundation with the trajectory of the skull fractures. The digital animation showed a chillingly clinical representation of the defendant, Raymond Vance, raising the iron tool and striking the victim from behind while they were facing away toward the kitchen entryway. The mechanical repetition of the simulation on the screens created an oppressive rhythm in the room, forcing everyone in the court to witness the raw, physical reality of the 2006 execution over and over again. Vance watched the digital reconstruction from the defense table, his head bowed slightly, his hands clenched tightly together under the edge of the wood. The stoic, unbothered facade he had maintained since his arrest in Chicago was showing severe structural cracks. His jaw twitched rhythmically with every strike animation that flashed across the monitors, and he refused to make eye contact with his own legal team as they whispered frantically behind their laptops. The absolute precision of the modern forensic reconstruction had transformed the historical disappearance into a live, undeniable event, leaving the defense with zero room to maneuver or construct an alternative timeline that did not end with their client holding the murder weapon. As the afternoon light faded outside the courthouse windows, casting long, dark shadows across the plaza, the prosecution officially rested its primary case-in-chief, handing the momentum over to a defense team that was visibly struggling to find a viable path forward. The court was adjourned until the following morning, leaving the jurors to depart under a heavy cloud of certainty that signaled the beginning of the end for the old killer's decades of evasion. The community outside waited with bated breath, the media trucks preparing their nightly live broadcasts as the legal machinery prepared to enter the final, unyielding phase of closing arguments and jury deliberations. The courtroom lights hummed with a sterile, low-frequency buzz as the morning of the trial's third week commenced, marking the definitive transition into the defense's formal presentation. The space had become an absolute crucible of tension, the public gallery packed tighter than on previous days as rumors spread through the courthouse corridors that Raymond Vance's legal team was preparing a high-velocity, high-risk counteroffensive. The defense attorney stood at the podium, his expression a calculated mix of defiance and professional gravity, holding a thick binder of technical transcripts that signaled an attempt to challenge the absolute baseline of the state's genomic infrastructure. The defense's primary strategy did not seek to humanize the aging defendant or provide an alternative emotional narrative for the 2006 disappearance. Instead, they launched a direct, technical assault on the chain of custody and the rapid DNA sequencing protocols utilized by the Maricopa County Forensic Laboratory. Their first expert witness was a private molecular geneticist from a high-profile consulting firm in California who took the stand with a clinical, unblinking intensity. Under direct examination, the witness methodically dissected the documentation surrounding the extraction of the skeletal remains from the backyard clay, pointing out a 3-hour window between the initial unearthing of the plastic tarp and its formal logging into the medical examiner's secure refrigeration facility. The defense attorney paced the length of the jury box, his voice rising with intentional, dramatic cadence as he pressed his witness on the potential for microcontamination during that undocumented 3-hour window. He suggested that the extreme ambient heat of the July afternoon could have caused the synthetic material of the tarp to sweat, potentially transferring external biological markers from previous property owners deep into the porous matrix of the skeletal remains. The implication was clear. The defense wanted the jury to believe that the DNA profile identifying the body was not a pristine, infallible signature, but a corrupted, cross-contaminated composite that could have belonged to any transient individual who had occupied the North Phoenix lot over the past 2 decades. The private geneticist nodded in agreement, projecting complex electropherogram charts onto the courtroom screens to highlight what he labeled as ambiguous baseline noise in the rapid DNA readouts. He argued that the high-velocity amplification techniques used by the state to secure a 24-hour identification had sacrificed scientific caution for political expediency, rushing to match the cold case file to satisfy the intense public interest generated by the anonymous tip. The jurors leaned forward, their faces twisted in concentration as they tried to parse the dense, highly technical jargon, the absolute certainty that the prosecution had built over the previous weeks suddenly clouding over with layers of scientific doubt. But the prosecution team remained entirely unmoved at their table, their lead attorney quietly organizing a single sheet of paper that contained the state's ultimate biometric rebuttal. When she stepped up for the cross-examination, her demeanor was sharp, dawn-dap, and entirely devoid of defensive hesitation. She did not engage in a drawn-out academic debate over the electropherogram charts. Instead, she walked directly to the witness stand and handed the defense expert a certified document from the Independent Federal Bureau of Investigation Data Validation Clearinghouse. With a cold, measured precision, the prosecutor forced the witness to read the document's central conclusion aloud to the court. The file revealed that the specific rapid DNA protocol used in this case had been subjected to a double-blind validation study involving over 10,000 degraded samples, achieving a mathematical accuracy rate of 99.9999% without a single instance of cross-contamination or false positive matching. Furthermore, she entered the secondary laboratory logs into evidence, proving that the bone core samples had been extracted from the deep, internal structure of the femur, a location completely shielded from any surface contamination or environmental sweating that could have occurred during the 3-hour transport window. The defense expert's technical objection collapsed under the weight of the empirical data. He was forced to admit under oath that the internal genomic sequence recovered from the grave could only belong to one specific individual, completely validating the state's identification and rendering the defense's contamination theory completely obsolete. The defense attorney sat down heavily at his table, his face turning a sharp, frustrated red as the prosecution systematically restored their unyielding wall of evidence in front of the jury. Raymond Vance watched the total deflation of his defense strategy with a hollow, catatonic gaze, his body sinking slightly lower into the leather chair as the reality of his legal isolation became absolute. The high-tech, digital shield his lawyers had tried to construct around his past had been shattered by the very science he had failed to anticipate during his 20 years of hiding in Chicago. The afternoon sun began to dip below the courthouse windows, casting long, dark shadows across the floorboards as the judge announced a brief recess, leaving the defense with only one remaining card to play before the case was handed over to the collective judgment of the jury. The legal options available to the defense had narrowed to a single, high-stakes tactical decision by the time the court reconvened for the final sessions of the third week. The atmosphere inside the third-floor courtroom was intensely pressurized, with the public gallery standing room only as rumors circulated that Raymond Vance might take the witness stand in a desperate bid to reframe the narrative of the 2006 disappearance. The defense attorney stood slowly, adjusting his jacket before looking toward the bench, his voice echoing in the silent room as he announced that the defense was resting its primary case without calling the defendant to testify. The calculation was clear, exposing Vance to a ruthless, high-velocity cross-examination by the prosecution would completely dismantle any remaining shred of ambiguity his team had managed to cultivate. The sudden conclusion of the defense's evidentiary phase shifted the momentum instantly to the absolute finality of closing arguments. The lead prosecutor walked deliberately to the center of the well, stopping directly in front of the jury box. She did not utilize a podium, notes, or digital slides. Instead, she stood before the 12 jurors as a direct, unyielding force, her voice projecting a sharp, rhythmic authority that commanded the room. She began by systematically weaving together the physical, digital, and biological threads that the state had entered into the record over the past 3 weeks, constructing a seamless, inescapable cage around the defendant. She forced the jury to look once more at the chronological intersection of July 2006, the precise alignment between the sudden silence in the North Phoenix neighborhood, the midnight bank withdrawals, the distinct silhouette of the Chevrolet Tahoe caught on traffic cameras, and the violent trauma mapped onto the excavated skull. She argued that the defendant had spent 2 decades living an absolute lie in Chicago, masquerading as a quiet automotive mechanic named Arthur Pendleton while a meticulous, synthetic grave lay hidden beneath the roots of the mesquite tree he had planted. The language was short, punchy, and designed to strip away any remaining sense of historical distance, framing the crime not as an ancient cold case, but as a live, calculated act of domestic execution that demanded an immediate, unyielding legal reckoning. When the defense attorney took his turn at the podium for his final address to the jury, his demeanor was marked by an aggressive, defensive urgency. He attempted to pivot the focus away from the scientific evidence, launching into a passionate warning about the dangers of modern forensic infallibility. He argued that the state had built a circumstantial trap based on an untraceable, anonymous phone call that denied the defense the basic constitutional right to confront their accuser. He paced the length of the rail, pointing a finger directly at the orange-clad defendant, demanding that the jury question whether it was truly justice to condemn an aging, broken man based on microscopic skin cells and digital logs that had sat unverified in state databases for a generation. But the rhetorical desperation of the defense failed to pierce the dense wall of empirical data the prosecution had established. The judge delivered the formal, highly structured jury instructions with a cold, clinical precision, detailing the exact legal definitions of premeditation, first-degree murder, and unlawful concealment. The 12 jurors filed out of the courtroom in single file, their faces unreadable masks of intense concentration, leaving the chamber in a state of sudden, breathless suspension as the legal machinery paused for deliberations. Raymond Vance sat entirely motionless at the defense table, his eyes locked on the empty jury box as the heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind the panel. The stoic anonymity that had shielded him through 20 years of Midwestern winters had completely dissolved, leaving only the raw, physical reality of a man facing the absolute termination of his freedom. The clock on the courtroom wall ticked rhythmically through the afternoon, each sound marking the slow, inevitable pressure of the truth as the community outside waited for the final, historic verdict that would permanently rewrite the legacy of the 2006 Phoenix cold case. The absolute stillness that descended upon the third-floor courtroom during the hours of jury deliberation felt less like a pause in the proceedings and more like the heavy, pressurized atmosphere before a desert thunderstorm. For 20 years, the secret had remained compressed beneath 6 feet of hard Arizona clay, protected by the silence of a changing suburban landscape and the calculated invisibility of a man who thought he had outrun his own shadow. Now, that entire generation of evasion had been reduced to a simple, binary choice resting in the hands of 12 ordinary citizens locked inside a windowless room just past the mahogany rail. The public gallery remained packed to its legal capacity, the observers sitting shoulder to shoulder in the dimming afternoon light, their low whispers cut short every time the heavy wooden door of the deliberation room rattled. At exactly 4:12 p.m., the rhythmic, double knock of the bailiff's staff signaled that a definitive consensus had been reached. The transition from agonizing anticipation to immediate, high-velocity action happened in a matter of seconds. The news crews scrambled to activate their live digital feeds, the defense attorneys adjusted their files with sharp, nervous movements, and the prosecution team stood in a unified, silent line at their table. When Raymond Vance was led back into the room by 3 armed transport officers, his physical frame seemed completely drained of the defensive posture he had maintained since his arrest in Chicago. He did not look toward the gallery, nor did he look at his counsel. His eyes were fixed entirely on the carpeted floorboards, his hands trembling slightly within the heavy steel loops of his waist chains. The jurors filed back into the box in a slow, disciplined line, their expressions entirely neutral, refusing to make eye contact with either side of the well, a classic courtroom indicator that signaled an absolute, uncompromising verdict. The judge took his place on the elevated bench, his face an unreadable mask of judicial authority as he received the signed verdict form from the foreperson. The reading of the document by the court clerk cut through the silent room like a sequence of sharp, concussive strikes, each word cementing the absolute termination of the defendant's decades-long deception, guilty of murder in the first degree, guilty of concealment of a corpse, guilty of grand theft. The reaction within the courtroom was instantaneous, but remarkably disciplined. A collective, audible intake of breath swept through the rows of the victim's family, followed by the quiet, muffled sound of tears that had been delayed for 2 decades. On the other side of the rail, Raymond Vance did not scream, he did not protest, and he did not look up. He merely closed his eyes as the finality of the words locked into the permanent public record, his head bowing forward as the last remnant of his stolen alias, Arthur Pendleton, vanished forever into the sterile reality of a maximum security prison cell. The defense team sat in stunned, silent defeat, their frantic, high-tech arguments about genetic contamination completely discarded by a jury that had chosen to believe the unyielding, mathematical truth of the bone core DNA, and the glowing blue maps of the concrete foundation. The judge wastefully spent no time delaying the final act of justice, transitioning immediately into the formal sentencing phase under an expedited statutory mandate. He looked down at the aging killer, his voice dropping to a low, resonant register that filled every corner of the crowded room, stating that the sheer, calculated cruelty of the backyard burial, the act of standing under a mesquite tree in the dead of night to dig a hole while an entire neighborhood slept, warranted the maximum penalty allowed under Arizona law. The gavel came down with a sharp, explosive echo that signaled the absolute conclusion of the state's legal machinery. Raymond Vance was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that the individual who had tried to bury his crime in the desert would spend the remainder of his natural life behind the concrete walls of the state penitentiary. The true impact of the historic verdict, however, rippled far beyond the downtown courthouse, tearing through the quiet streets of the North Phoenix suburb where the nightmare had begun 20 years prior. The yellow crime scene tape had finally been removed, but the physical reality of the yard remained permanently altered, the fresh, clean topsoil marking the exact spot where the mesquite tree had been completely uprooted and destroyed by the forensic teams. The current residents of the block stood on their porches in the cooling desert evening, watching the final media trucks pack up their equipment and pull away from the curb. The oppressive, suffocating silence that had hung over the street since that hot July night in 2006 was finally gone, replaced by a quiet, collective sense of relief, a shared realization that the ghost story whispered by rookie cops for a generation had finally been resolved by the light of modern science. As the late-night maintenance scripts at the State Data Repository initiated their routine cryptographic sweep, the file entry for the 2006 Phoenix cold case was updated to its final, unchangeable status: case closed/conviction secured/sentence imposed. The system checked the integrity of the digital records, locked the encryption keys of the genomic sequencing maps, and archived the comprehensive video confession into the permanent municipal history ledger in a fraction of a millisecond. The long, agonizing narrative arc had reached its absolute structural termination point. There were no more assets to track, no more hidden shell companies to audit, no more appeals to litigate, and no more biological remnants to analyze. The case had been completely absorbed into the vast, silent bedrock of the law, an unyielding, permanent monument to the reality that no matter how deep a secret is buried, it eventually dissolves when confronted with the quiet, persistent pressure of the truth. The absolute institutional processing of Raymond Vance into the maximum security infrastructure of the Arizona State Prison Complex at Florence marked the definitive transition of the case from a live cultural narrative into the cold mechanism of corrections bureaucracy. By the late summer of 2026, the intake protocols had been completed with the same sterile efficiency that had characterized the trial. Vance's physical identity was systematically replaced by an 8-digit inmate identification number, his civilian remnants completely stripped away in favor of standard-issue institutional denim. The prison yard, enclosed by 3 tiers of razor wire and monitored by automated kinetic security arrays, became the absolute boundary of his physical reality, a stark, concrete contrast to the sprawling Midwestern landscape where he had hidden under a stolen name for 2 decades. At the Phoenix Police Department's Central Homicide Precinct, the physical artifacts that had built the state's unyielding forensic wall were prepared for their final journey into the deep administrative archives. The primary detectives on the task force spent days compiling the massive closing binders, cross-referencing thousands of pages of genomic data, digital financial logs, and the high-resolution luminol maps of the North Phoenix concrete foundation. The heavy cardboard evidence boxes containing the physical components of the investigation, the rusted iron pry bar, the mineral-stained industrial plastic tarp, and the dead digital wristwatch recovered from the caliche clay, were loaded into a secure transport van destined for the subterranean, climate-controlled vault facility in downtown Phoenix. The technician responsible for logging the materials into the long-term storage facility moved with a practiced, detached routine. Each item was scanned into the state's permanent tracking database, its unique barcode linked directly to the final judicial disposition entry, case closed/sentence, life without parole/defendant incarcerated. As the heavy steel vault doors slid closed, sealing the evidence containers into a permanent darkness alongside thousands of resolved historical crimes, the physical remnants of the 2006 nightmare were effectively frozen in time. The tools of the murder and the protective wrappings of the grave were no longer items of public controversy or media speculation. They had become pure historical data points, silent material witnesses to a 20-year evasion that had been shattered by the relentless progression of molecular science. The financial fallout of the historic conviction also reached its absolute structural termination point as the State Asset Forfeiture Division completed its liquidation of the suspects, Midwestern Holdings. The cash-only automotive repair shop near the Chicago rail yards, which Vance had used as an economic shield to maintain his invisibility, was permanently dissolved by order of the federal receivership. The specialized tools, the heavy hydraulic lifts, and the accumulated liquid capital recovered from the site were sold at public auction, with the entirety of the proceeds being automatically transferred into the state's Crime Victims Compensation Endowment. The very infrastructure that had sustained the killer's flight from justice was now permanently repurposed to fund the advanced genetic testing sequences required to clear the remaining backlog of historical cold cases across the Southwest. In the North Phoenix neighborhood where the crime had lain buried for 20 years, the psychological equilibrium of the block began to settle into a new, deeply reflective baseline. The current occupants of the stucco home had fully completed the restoration of their property, laying down fresh turf and gravel over the exact coordinate where the ancient mesquite tree had stood. The physical scar in the earth was gone, covered by layers of manicured desert landscaping that mirrored the quiet, suburban facade of the rest of the street. Neighbors who had once stood at their window screens watching the high-intensity, forensic excavation returned to the ordinary, mundane routines of daily life, the intense paranoia that had gripped the block during the trial slowly dissolving into a calm, hard-won peace. The long-term legacy of the Phoenix 2006 case was ultimately cemented within the academic curriculum of the state's law enforcement academies and forensic science programs. The investigative timeline was adopted as the primary case study for advanced genomic genealogy training, demonstrating to incoming generations of digital detectives how a single, anonymous voice and rapid DNA technology could completely dismantle a decades-old deception. The file was studied not for its dramatic narrative or its high-stakes courtroom resolution, but for its empirical precision, a definitive, scientific confirmation that the physical properties of a crime scene remain locked within the earth, waiting for the technology of the future to inevitably pull them into the light. As the automated systems at the State Data Repository executed their nightly cryptographic maintenance cycle, the system checked the file integrity of case file 2006 PHX cold, verified the permanent encryption keys of the matching genomic sequences, and logged the transaction into the municipal history ledger in a fraction of a millisecond. The narrative arc had achieved absolute structural finality. There were no more assets to recover, no more hidden shell companies to investigate, no more appeals to litigate, and no more biological remnants to analyze. The cold case had been completely absorbed into the vast, silent bedrock of the law, an unyielding, permanent monument to the reality that every secret eventually dissolves when confronted with the quiet, persistent pressure of the truth. The complete administrative absorption of the Vance file into the Arizona Department of Corrections digital infrastructure did not mark the end of the case's systemic ripples, but rather the beginning of its institutional secondary phase. Inside the concrete corridors of the Florence facility, the mechanical daily routine of the state's most isolated population became the absolute boundary of Raymond Vance's remaining years. The high-velocity news cycles that had tracked his extradition from Chicago and the subsequent forensic revelations in the Maricopa County courtroom had moved on, leaving him to navigate the sterile, hyper-regulated reality of a permanent maximum security placement. His hours were dictated entirely by automated cell block lockouts, scheduled visual head counts, and the low, constant hum of commercial air filtration units struggling against the intense desert heat outside. Outside the prison walls, the legal precedent set by the state's rapid DNA sequencing victory began to systematically reshape the standard operating procedures of homicide units across the entire Southwest. The Phoenix Police Department's cold case squad, newly energized by the absolute structural resolution of the 2006 file, utilized the judicial validation of the Vance trial to launch a comprehensive audit of all unsolved missing persons cases dating back to the mid-1990s. The precise legal parameters that had allowed the prosecution to enter the concrete core luminol maps and the deep bone genomic data into evidence became the structural template for 24 new active investigations, effectively transforming a single neighborhood horror into a systemic blueprint for modern forensic accountability. In the analytical laboratories where the biological breakthrough had been achieved, the specific genetic profile recovered from beneath the mesquite tree was transitioned into a permanent validation control standard. The digitized sequence, stripped of all personal identifying names to comply with strict federal privacy regulations, was entered into the national database as a benchmark for measuring the accuracy of next-generation sequencing equipment. The molecular remnants of the 2006 victim, once hidden in the dark caliche clay of a forgotten suburban backyard, had become an essential, unyielding tool for calibrating the very technology that would ensure future fugitives could never replicate Vance's 20-year run of evasion. Simultaneously, the physical site of the excavation in North Phoenix continued its quiet, total integration into the modern suburban fabric. The property records for the lot were updated at the county recorder's office, the historical foreclosure markers and forensic seizure liens permanently cleared from the deed. The home was sold to a young family entirely disconnected from the historical timeline of the crime, individuals who only knew the 2006 disappearance as a distant, abstract piece of local trivia. The new owners planted a clean, minimalist desert garden where the high-intensity search grids had once been staked out, completing the physical erasing of the crime scene and restoring a sense of absolute normalcy to the block. For the aging neighbors who had lived through both the quiet vanishing in 2006 and the sudden, disruptive excavation of 2026, the finality of the prison sentence allowed for the closure of a long-standing psychological chapter. The collective suspicion that had lingered over the street for a generation, the unvoiced questions about what had truly happened behind the closed blinds of the corner house, had been completely replaced by the empirical clarity of the court record. The story was no longer an open-ended rumor whispered during neighborhood gatherings, but a resolved historical fact, bounded by a life sentence and verified by the absolute authority of molecular science. As the automated maintenance scripts at the Arizona Department of Public Safety executed their scheduled weekend backup cycles, the file entry for Raymond Vance, along with all associated forensic appendices, was synchronized across the federal judicial archives. The digital ledger recorded the successful transfer of data packets, verified the integrity of the cryptographic signatures, and locked the record against any future unauthorized administrative modification. The systematic processing of the 2006 Phoenix cold case had reached its absolute structural termination point, leaving the modern legal system to stand as an unyielding, permanent barrier between the killer and the freedom he had stolen for 2 decades. The institutional finality of Raymond Vance's permanent incarceration within the Florence complex rippled backward into the administrative architecture of the Maricopa County Clerk's Office, where the physical paper record of the state's case underwent its final structural transformation. By the late autumn of 2026, the temporary working files utilized by the prosecution during the high-velocity trial were systematically recalled from the active courtroom desks. A specialized team of judicial archivists began the grueling process of converting thousands of pages of motions, cross-examination transcripts, and scientific affidavits into a permanent, highly secure digital microfilm format designed to survive for centuries. The physical documents were fed through high-speed optical character recognition scanners, their contents translated into a standardized, universally accessible legal text format. Each motion filed by the defense, their desperate, late-stage challenges to the rapid DNA sequencing protocols, their objections to the concrete core luminol mapping, and their attempts to suppress the anonymous tip logs, was meticulously cataloged alongside the judge's definitive, unyielding rulings. The resulting digital master file was assigned a permanent historical shelf location within the state's secure legal repository, ensuring that the complete mechanical history of the 2006 case was locked into the permanent institutional memory of the Arizona judiciary. As the physical paperwork was prepared for transport to the state's remote, climate-controlled document vaults, the specialized hardware components used to uncover the backyard grave were returned to the Phoenix Police Department's Central Laboratory inventory. The ground-penetrating radar units and the multispectral digital imaging arrays that had mapped the caliche clay beneath the mesquite tree were subjected to routine calibration cycles, their diagnostic logs cleared of the specific coordinates that had defined the 2026 excavation. The tools were returned to active service, ready to be deployed to other active crime scenes, their operational memory of the North Phoenix backyard completely erased even as their scientific success remained permanently recorded in the state's legal precedents. The broader impact of the Vance conviction continued to manifest within the regional banking sector, where the financial tracking methods perfected during the investigation were formally integrated into standard fraud and anti-money laundering protocols. The specific pattern of cash-only structuring and identity shielding that Vance had utilized to maintain his Arthur Pendleton alias in Chicago was encoded into the automated monitoring algorithms used by major Southwestern financial institutions. The system was programmed to detect the subtle, low-frequency anomalies that indicated a live individual attempting to exist entirely outside the modern digital banking grid, effectively turning the killer's historical evasion strategy into a real-time defensive shield against contemporary financial crimes. In the North Phoenix neighborhood, the physical landscape continued its seamless, post-forensic evolution, the quiet residential block completely reclaiming its original suburban identity. The memory of the high-intensity searchlights, the excavators, and the media tents that had dominated the street during the early months of 2026 had faded into the background of the neighborhood's collective consciousness. Children rode bicycles past the corner lot without glancing at the spot where the mesquite tree had stood, and the property values on the street fully stabilized, the historical stigma of the 20-year cold case entirely neutralized by the absolute finality of the judicial verdict. Within the state's legal education system, the closing arguments delivered by the prosecution were selected as a foundational text for advanced trial advocacy seminars. Law students studied the precise, rhythmic cadence of the state's presentation, analyzing how the team had systematically constructed an inescapable cage of empirical data without relying on emotional rhetoric or circumstantial assumptions. The case study demonstrated the absolute primacy of modern forensics over defensive obfuscation, teaching the next generation of prosecutors how to present highly complex, molecular evidence in a manner that left zero room for reasonable doubt in the minds of a contemporary jury. As the automated data systems at the Arizona Department of Public Safety completed their standard midnight synchronization protocols, the digital profile of case file 2006 PHX Cold achieved its permanent, unchangeable state across all federated law enforcement networks. The system executed its final integrity verification, validated the cryptographic signatures of the genomic sequencing maps, and locked the record against any future administrative alterations. The narrative had reached its absolute structural termination point, leaving the modern legal apparatus to stand as a permanent, unyielding monument to the reality that time can never truly dilute the physical evidence of a crime. The definitive classification of Raymond Vance's institutional file within the long-term medical and psychological tracking unit of the Arizona Department of Corrections marked the opening of the investigation's 15th structural chapter. By the late autumn of 2026, the initial shock of the transition had completely worn off, replaced by the crushing, mechanical weight of maximum security isolation. The internal corrections staff processed the aging inmate not as a figure of high-profile true crime intrigue, but as a standard, high-risk medical asset whose physical degradation required routine monitoring. The absolute finality of his life sentence, without the possibility of parole, meant that his existence was now measured entirely by the internal metrics of the prison system: blood pressure logs, medication distribution windows, and the precise, automated timing of cell door locks. Outside the reinforced concrete walls of the Florence facility, the legal and scientific precedents established by the case were formally introduced into the National Law Enforcement Framework. A delegation from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Behavioral Analysis Unit and the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime arrived in Phoenix to conduct a comprehensive structural review of the 20-year timeline. The federal analysts were not interested in the sensational aspects of the murder, but rather in the absolute institutional methodology that allowed a fugitive to successfully maintain a complete cognitive and economic dual identity for 2 decades without triggering automated systemic red flags. The resulting federal white paper utilized the Vance investigation as the definitive model for studying the long-term survival mechanics of historical fugitives. The document dissected how the transition from Raymond Vance to Arthur Pendleton was achieved through the exploitation of pre-digital administrative vulnerabilities in the mid-2000s, contrasting it with the modern, hyper-connected biometric landscape of 2026 that ultimately made his continued evasion mathematically impossible. The analysis proved that while human memory degrades, the physical and digital footprint left behind by a high-velocity violent crime remains completely static, waiting for the inevitable advancement of forensic capabilities to catch up with the past. Simultaneously, the Maricopa County Forensic Science Center completed the formal decommissioning of the physical laboratory space that had been dedicated exclusively to the 2006 North Phoenix evidence arrays. The specialized chemical analysis benches, where the rapid DNA sequencing chips had verified the victim's identity within a 24-hour window, were cleared of all biological material and subjected to a deep, multi-stage decontamination protocol. The remaining liquid reagents, target DNA templates, and physical core samples extracted from the deep matrix of the femur were transferred to a highly secure, cryogenically preserved genomic archive located in an underground facility managed by the state university. This permanent preservation of the physical genomic material ensured that if the defense team attempted to initiate a post-conviction relief petition based on future technological updates, the state possessed an uncorrupted, empirical duplicate of the exact biological signature that secured the conviction. The laboratory technicians logged the successful archiving sequence into the state database, assigning the digital keys to the state attorney general's office and effectively locking the scientific foundation of the case into an unalterable legal vault that no future appellate strategy could easily penetrate. In the North Phoenix residential block, the final traces of the 2026 investigative disruption were completely absorbed by the relentless march of suburban life. The local neighborhood association, which had been forced to manage intense media traffic and public curiosity during the excavation and trial phases, officially closed its temporary administrative subcommittee on community security. The street returned to its original, quiet rhythm, the stucco house on the corner standing under the bright Arizona sun as a symbol of absolute restoration rather than a monument to domestic horror. The real estate listings for the surrounding properties no longer carried the unvoiced discount associated with an active crime scene, the neighborhood's economic equilibrium fully restored by the absolute finality of the judicial verdict. Within the state's political landscape, the legislative committees responsible for funding law enforcement infrastructure utilized the Vance verdict to justify a massive, multi-million-dollar expansion of the state's centralized cold case data hub. Lawmakers cited the absolute precision of the 2006 resolution as empirical proof that investing in advanced ground-penetrating radar arrays, high-sensitivity luminol subflooring analysis, and rapid DNA technology yielded a direct, undeniable return on public safety. The Vance Amendment, as it was informally labeled in the Capitol corridors, secured permanent budgetary guarantees for the systematic technological upgrading of rural sheriff departments across the state, ensuring that the forensic lessons learned in the urban center of Phoenix would be deployed to eliminate historical backlogs in every remote corner of the desert Southwest. As the automated database synchronization routines at the National Crime Information Center executed their scheduled weekend maintenance scripts, the status code for Raymond Vance was updated across all global law enforcement networks to reflect his permanent, non-transferable maximum security placement. The system verified the absolute integrity of the data packets, confirmed the cryptographic validity of the digital fingerprints, and archived the entire 30,000-page case history into the permanent historical ledger in a fraction of a second. The structural progression of the narrative had reached an unyielding, permanent stasis point, leaving the machinery of the state to stand as a silent, eternal guardian over the truth that had been dragged from the dark caliche clay into the absolute light of justice. The absolute institutional containment of Raymond Vance within the maximum security perimeter of the Florence complex shifted into a permanent administrative routine as the winter of 2026 approached. Inside the secure housing unit, the passage of time was stripped of all civilian markers, reduced to the stark, mechanical metrics of institutional compliance. The high-velocity media coverage that had once broadcast his face across national networks had completely evaporated, leaving his daily existence to be defined entirely by the cold efficiency of the Department of Corrections. For the staff assigned to the high-security block, Inmate 308422 was not a subject of true crime fascination, but a permanent, high-risk administrative asset whose physical footprint was strictly monitored by automated biometric tracking arrays and scheduled headcounts. Outside the reinforced concrete walls, the systemic ripples of the landmark conviction began to influence the broader legal landscape of the American judicial system. The Maricopa County Superior Court completed the formal distribution of the certified trial records to the state law repository, establishing the Vance trial transcripts as a seminal reference point for cases involving the intersection of anonymous digital sourcing and rapid genomic sequencing. Appellate courts throughout the Southwest began citing the definitive rulings issued during the trial to reject defense motions seeking to suppress evidence derived from advanced rapid DNA platforms, effectively transforming the specific forensic methodology used to uncover the backyard grave into a permanent, unyielding shield for modern law enforcement. At the Phoenix Police Department's Central Precinct, the structural evolution of the cold case squad reached its logical conclusion. The specialized task force that had been assembled following the 2026 anonymous tip was formally integrated into a permanent, state-funded Bureau of Forensic Archaeology and Historical Genomic Analysis. The detectives who had overseen the excavation beneath the mesquite tree were appointed to lead the new unit, tasked with applying the exact multidisciplinary framework, combining high-resolution ground-penetrating radar, concrete core luminol extraction, and rapid molecular genealogy, to over 300 unsolved disappearances dating back to the late 20th century. The physical laboratory instruments that had processed the skeletal remains were subjected to an exhaustive, high-level maintenance protocol by independent field engineers. The advanced sequencing units were calibrated against the state's newly established control standards, their internal processing memory completely cleared of the specific genomic maps that had broken Vance's 20-year run of evasion. The hardware was returned to the active operational grid, its clinical capabilities ready to be deployed against the next historical file, ensuring that the scientific legacy of the 2006 case remained dynamic and forward-facing even as the physical evidence itself sat frozen in the subterranean vaults. In the North Phoenix neighborhood where the crime had lain buried for 2 decades, the process of total environmental and psychological restoration was complete. The corner lot stood as a quiet, unassuming testament to suburban normalcy, its manicured gravel and desert flora completely erasing the visual memory of the intense forensic excavation that had dominated the block earlier in the year. The current property owners, fully insulated from the historical timeline by the finality of the judicial verdict, maintained their daily routines without interference from true crime tourists or media updates, the neighborhood's social equilibrium completely restored to its original, peaceful baseline. Within the federal financial regulatory framework, the analytical data derived from Vance's decades-long identity theft as Arthur Pendleton was permanently encoded into the next-generation risk assessment protocols utilized by the banking sector. The specific methods he had employed to operate a cash-only automotive shop in Chicago, while completely avoiding modern biometric and digital authentication networks, were used to design real-time defensive algorithms. These systems were deployed across major banking networks to immediately detect and flag anomalous individuals attempting to maintain absolute economic invisibility, turning the killer's historical flight from justice into an active tool for preventing modern financial subversion. As the automated data repository servers at the Arizona Department of Public Safety initiated their standard midnight synchronization cycles, the digital profile for case file 2006 PHX Cold was verified across all federated law enforcement networks. The system executed its routine cryptographic validation, confirmed the absolute integrity of the encrypted data packets, and locked the historical ledger against any future administrative modifications. The narrative had achieved a state of permanent, institutional finality, leaving the scientific and legal machinery of the state to stand as an unyielding monument to the reality that time can never truly dilute the physical truth of a crime. The permanent administrative stasis of Raymond Vance within the Florence maximum security complex deepened into an unyielding, rhythmic uniformity as the late winter of 2026 transitioned into the early months of the following year. Inside the sterile confines of the high-security housing unit, the passage of days was entirely stripped of personal meaning, reduced to a series of mechanical interactions with the correctional apparatus. The high-profile media interest that had once dominated national true crime broadcasts had completely fallen away, leaving inmate 308422 to exist solely as a digital entry within the Department of Corrections' operational ledger. His physical movement was bound by the unyielding architecture of reinforced concrete and automated steel sliders, monitored continuously by internal biometric tracking arrays that left zero room for the personal autonomy he had stolen during his 2 decades of evasion in Chicago. Outside the immediate perimeter of the prison facility, the legal and technological ripples of the landmark conviction continued to systematically reconfigure the operational protocols of the Southwestern judicial system. The Maricopa County Superior Court officially transferred the certified 3,000-page trial transcript archive to the State Law Repository, permanently establishing the Vance case as the primary legal precedent for the integration of anonymous digital sourcing and rapid genomic sequencing. Appellate courts throughout the region began citing the definitive evidentiary rulings from the trial to systematically overrule defense motions that sought to challenge next-generation DNA analysis platforms, creating an institutional shield that protected modern forensic methodologies from tactical legal obfuscation. At the Phoenix Police Department's central headquarters, the structural transformation initiated by the 2026 breakthrough reached its final, permanent institutionalization. The temporary task force that had executed the delicate excavation beneath the North Phoenix mesquite tree was formally reorganized into the Permanent Bureau of Forensic Archaeology and Historical Genomic Analysis. Backed by dedicated state funding secured through the legislative interest generated by the Vance verdict, the new bureau began a systematic, technological audit of over 300 cold case files dating back to the pre-digital era of the late 20th century. The precise combination of high-resolution ground-penetrating radar, multispectral concrete subflooring analysis, and rapid molecular genealogy developed during the Vance investigation was codified into the standard operating manual for all future historical homicide inquiries across the state. Simultaneously, the advanced molecular tracking instruments utilized by the Maricopa County Forensic Science Center were subjected to a rigorous, multi-stage recalibration and maintenance cycle by independent field engineers. The sequencing chips that had mapped the deep bone core DNA of the victim within a critical 24-hour window were removed, cataloged, and replaced with next-generation processing units. The internal digital memory of the laboratory hardware was completely purged of the specific genomic signatures that had broken Vance's stolen identity as Arthur Pendleton, ensuring that the clinical testing environment remained pristine and entirely uncompromised as it was integrated back into the active law enforcement testing grid to confront the next historical file. In the North Phoenix suburban neighborhood where the crime had remained hidden for a generation, the process of physical and environmental reclamation reached an absolute baseline of normalcy. The corner residential lot stood under the clear Arizona sun as a quiet, unassuming testament to suburban peace, its pristine desert landscaping and manicured gravel completely erasing the visual remnants of the intense forensic excavation that had disrupted the block earlier in the year. The current property owners, fully insulated from the historical timeline by the definitive finality of the life sentence, conducted their daily routines without the intrusion of true crime curiosity seekers or media vehicles, the neighborhood's social and psychological equilibrium completely restored to its original, quiet baseline. Within the federal financial regulatory structure, the highly specific data sets derived from Vance's decades of economic invisibility were permanently integrated into the next-generation risk assessment matrices utilized by the banking sector. The precise methods he had employed to operate a cash-only automotive repair facility in the Chicago rail yards, maintaining an absolute separation from modern biometric validation systems and digital authentication networks, were used to program advanced, real-time defensive algorithms. These defensive systems were deployed across major southwestern banking consortia to instantly flag anomalous banking behaviors and identification anomalies that indicated a live individual attempting to maintain absolute digital non-existence, transforming the killer's historical flight from justice into an active tool for preventing contemporary financial fraud and identity manipulation. As the automated data systems at the Arizona Department of Public Safety executed their scheduled midnight synchronization protocols, the digital profile of case file 2006 PHX Cold was verified across all federated law enforcement databases. The system completed its routine cryptographic validation, confirmed the absolute integrity of the encrypted data packets, and locked the historical ledger against any future administrative modifications. The narrative had achieved a state of permanent, institutional finality, leaving the scientific, legal, and bureaucratic machinery of the state to stand as an unyielding monument to the reality that time can never dilute the physical truth of a crime scene or protect a fugitive from the inevitable, quiet pressure of modern justice. The definitive transition of case file 2006 PHX Cold from an active, high-velocity legal battle into a permanent reference standard within the American Forensic Archive marked the arrival of its 18th structural chapter. By the late winter of 2026, the systemic machinery of the state had completely processed the physical, digital, and genomic remnants of the investigation, locking them into an unyielding administrative vault designed to outlast the generation that witnessed the crime. The case was no longer a matter of public debate or active law enforcement pursuit. It had been completely absorbed into the institutional infrastructure of the state, serving as an absolute, mathematical proof of modern forensic capability. Inside the secure administrative offices of the Maricopa County Forensic Science Center, a team of digital data architects began the formal process of converting the entire Vance case file into a centralized machine learning training set. The objective was purely technical: the rapid DNA sequencing logs, the multispectral concrete subflooring maps, and the ground-penetrating radar arrays utilized during the North Phoenix excavation were compiled into an algorithmic baseline. This baseline was designed to train predictive artificial intelligence models used by the federal government to analyze historical anomalies in soil density and subterranean biological degradation. The molecular signature extracted from the deep bone matrix of the victim became a primary control point, a flawless data standard against which future automated cold case scanning systems would measure the probability of clandestine burials across the arid landscapes of the Southwest. The physical evidence itself, the iron pry bar, the degraded synthetic tarp, and the digital wristwatch recovered from the caliche clay, underwent a final preservation protocol before being transferred to its permanent location within the state's high-security long-term storage repository. A specialized conservation technician treated each item with a microscopic, inert polymer coating designed to stop all chemical degradation, freezing the artifacts in their exact 2026 state. The items were placed inside heavy, vacuum-sealed nitrogen chambers, completely isolated from ambient air, moisture, and ultraviolet light. The vault doors, constructed of reinforced steel and secured by multi-factor biometric authentication protocols, closed upon the containers, sealing the physical fragments of the 2006 nightmare into an absolute, permanent darkness. Simultaneously, the financial tracking systems that had dismantled Vance's stolen identity as Arthur Pendleton were officially institutionalized within the Arizona Department of Revenue's modern audit protocols. The specific financial footprint Vance left behind, the low-frequency cash structuring, the reliance on outdated paper invoicing, and the utilization of commercial real estate holdings registered under defunct corporate charters, was used to build a real-time behavioral model for state tax enforcement. The model, named the Vance Resolution Matrix, was deployed across the state's economic monitoring grid to automatically flag businesses operating with an unnatural level of digital insulation, effectively converting the killer's 20-year evasion strategy into a permanent, automated trap for contemporary financial anomalies. In the North Phoenix neighborhood where the excavation had taken place, the final structural remnants of the 2026 investigation vanished from the municipal grid. The city's Public Works Department completed a routine repaving project along the residential block, laying down a fresh, unbroken layer of dark asphalt that covered the entire